All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and call this workshop to order. We appreciate everybody coming. I don't actually have an agenda in front of me, but it seems like we published an agenda that had the pledge and an invocation in it. So I'm hoping that staff got someone to do the invocation. If not, I will call on Deacon Martin.
Mr. Mayor,
thank you very much.
Marsha Lee is going to be giving the invocation.
And we'll do a better job communicating. Thank you, Miss Marsha. With that, I need approval of the agenda first as was published.
So moved.
I have a motion from Commissioner Hersom, a second from Commissioner Coleman. Is there any questions or changes to the agenda from the dais? Does the public have any questions or changes to the agenda? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Thank you. Motion passed unanimously. And as Ms. Marsha makes her way for the invocation, if you would please remain standing after the invocation for the Pledge of Allegiance. And once again, thank you, ma'am, for being here tonight.
Good evening. I ask you to bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that you promise to be with us always. Thank you that your presence is with us right now. Lord, as we gather today at this workshop, we ask that you will be with us, be in the midst. Help us to make decisions that will be pleasing to you. Help us to be able to discuss the matters at hand in a reasonable way and to be willing to give up our own way. God, let this meeting be productive, as should be the case in all of the areas of our lives. Help us to keep you in the forefront of our mind as we do the work set before us. May you bless each person who took the time to gather here today, and let your hand of protection be upon them throughout the rest of the week. Let the work done here tonight come to fruition, and let it all be for your glory. Help us each to do our part to bring this plan of discussion to life. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for that beautiful invocation, Ms. Marsha. And then our one item on tonight's agenda is the future options for law enforcement in the city of Newberry. Mr. Manager, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's been a long-awaited workshop. As by our notes, the Commission asked us to look into alternatives for law enforcement for the city of Newberry, going back a little more than a year or so ago. And things like Canterbury and Ag Tech Park and a couple of other things have delayed this workshop. We appreciate the Commission's patience with us as we got our information compiled. One of those alternatives that was specifically asked for by the Commission was looking at the creation of Newberry Police Department. So we're going to spend some time discussing that tonight. Special thanks go out to High Springs City Manager Ed Booth and his team. They put in a lot of effort helping us put alternatives together for you, and they're taking time out of their schedule to be here tonight to be able to respond to questions. Similar thank you to Colonel Huckstadt, Sheriff Darnell, and their team. Similarly, they put in quite a bit of effort helping us understand our alternatives. Both agencies have spent some time talking to us about what a Newberry Police Department ought to look like in their opinion, so they've gone out of their way to give us that type of support, and I'd like to publicly thank both entities for their helps getting ready for tonight. So workshop format tonight, so and we have a pretty good slide deck if you've gone through it. So as always, just want to state, if you have questions, stop us and let's have the discussion right there. It's not such a well-honed presentation that we would lose our train of thought. We'd like to have the conversation tonight. Format.
Mr. Manager, before you get into that, I want to extend my gratitude to ASO and High Springs PD as well, and to the Commission for being so patient to get to this point. And I want to just reiterate the point that the manager just made about this being a workshop. There are no decisions that will be made tonight. Tonight is an information gathering evening for the Commission. So everybody who's here in the audience and are tuning in either on Facebook or YouTube, if you hear something and you want to reach out to the commissioners, you will have plenty of time to do so and have those conversations. So tonight is a conversation. Thank you, Mr. Manager. Go ahead and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also want to point out that the commission should have, the mayor and commission should have 5 handouts. The first is our slide deck, just a few, I think there's 48 slides in there. Second is a law alternative worksheet. This is also in the slide deck. It's just across 2 slides, so we compiled it so that you could see it as take-home material. There's a worksheet that says HSPD costs, High Springs Police Department costs. There's another worksheet that is Newberry Police Department. It's a kind of a quasi-budget. And then the last is a report that staff has prepared called the 2019 Law Enforcement Report. So that's kind of a list of all the handout information you should have. Moving on to page 3. So just the format of the workshop, kind of give you an overview of what we see as the process, at least it's staff suggestion to start the conversation for the process, and then we'll kind of work into how it actually works out after that as we go through the evening in the next few months. And then our presentation, we'll spend some time talking about Newberry Police Department and what that would look like, how it might work, and then transition into alternatives for law enforcement services. Primarily, there are 3 entities that we're dealing with. It's Alachua County Sheriff's Office, High Springs Police Department, and then the City of Newberry Police Department if the commission was interested in initiating their own police department. And then we'll have, once we make it through the slide deck, we'll have time for questions and hopefully answers. If we don't have answers, we'll get them for you before we convene again, and then we'll do a wrap-up. So moving on into an overview for tonight's workshop, we're going to present information, have time for Q&A, and obtain feedback. It was hard for us to know. I mean, we have 3 entities with about 7 different offerings, but easily there could have been 100 different offerings, and we felt like at some point we just got to get feedback. We give the commission some general information and get some feedback on what the commission's interested in terms of level of service and direction, and then we'll refine that so that we can have some decision making a little bit later in August. We propose to come back towards the end of August at a regular or special city commission meeting to again look at alternatives. Maybe they'll be narrowed from tonight if the commission says not interested in a few of these. And then at that point, if we've done a good job in answering questions, the commission could give us direction on what their preference is, and we'll begin taking action, either writing up contracts or doing whatever the necessary action is to complete our budget if there's a budget impact for fiscal year 20, and getting prepared for either execution of a contract or whatever action is required to set wheels in motion for law enforcement in fiscal year 2021. As you know, just as kind of a little bit of a background information, we are currently completing the 2nd year of a 3-year contract. So law enforcement services in Newberry has already been contracted for fiscal year 2020, which is the one that begins in October. So all that we're discussing tonight is for fiscal year 2021, which begins in October of 2020, about 14 months out from now. So we'll move on to starting and operating Newberry's Police Department. And the team that has been working on this primarily from our staff's perspective has been Chief Buckner, Dallas Lee, Brian Thomas, and myself. Chief Buckner's not here tonight. He's unavailable. He really brings a lot to the table with his understanding of quasi-military type organization, public safety organization. So he's been a big asset to us. We've also received quite a bit of input on starting Newberry's Police Department from High Springs. City Manager Booth and his team, Chief DeCoursey, Deputy Chief Shepard, have been a big boost to us. And then there's lots of resources out there, and we've utilized these resources. I mean, when you get reports entitled Guidelines for Starting and Operating a New Police Department written by the Department of Justice, that's very capable document. It solves a lot of issues for you. All the resources that we compared and everyone we talked to said, Mike, you can't really go anywhere in this endeavor without data, knowing about yourselves and knowing why you might want a police department, what your issues are. So one of the first things we always do with just about every endeavor is kind of see what our peers are doing. So we developed a peer list of 7 to 8 cities. These are cities that are near us in size and population and are also kind of north central Florida, normally a coastal community, isn't really exactly like us because their property values are so much different from ours. So you get somebody in the north central Florida region, they kind of are dealing with the same economic climate that we are. So here's a table of 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 peer cities, what they are doing for law enforcement, what their populations are. The 2 that contract for law enforcement are both us and Brooksville. Brooksville is interesting because until 2017, through 2017, they had their own police department. And towards the end of 2017, they elected to disband their police department and began contracting for services with the Hernando County Sheriff's Department. So just as we were doing the research on them and saw that change, their budget at the time for a police department was in the $1.7 and $1.8 million range. So it was kind of an interesting juxtaposition from where we are, being similar in size to them and considering going from contract law enforcement with the Sheriff's Department into owning our own, which speaks to that old adage about history repeats itself if you just hang in there long enough. Over the next few slides, we'll kind of show you more information about just Newberry data and statistics on crime and things related to police operations. The call load data, which may look familiar to you, I believe we saw this at the last City Commission meeting. The Sheriff's Department provided this information to us. They provide it in their quarterly reports, but in the annual report, the State of the City address that Sheriff Darnell provided. So this just shows our call data and the number of calls that resulted in reports. You can see there's pretty big discrepancy. I guess maybe 1 out of 9 or 1 out of 10 calls actually results in a reportable action. And you can see that it looks like we've been trending down, but as I understand it from conversation with the Sheriff's Department, that really the difference between 7,400 in 2016 and 5,700 in 2018 is kind of in the noise. They consider that more of a flat or baseline and not necessarily trending down. Otherwise, we would make the recommendation that if we'll just hang in there for 20 years, there'll be no calls for service in Newberry and won't have to do any of this. But that's good information. Next slide shows a pie chart of crime statistics by category. You can see that primarily domestic violence, burglary, and assault and battery account for about 95% of the reported crimes in Newberry. And this table kind of shows the same information in tabular format. From the resources that we evaluated, all stressed that it's important to know why you might want to have a police department, and spoke about the right reasons for having a police department and maybe some not so right reasons for having a police department. So this identifies some of the right reasons why cities might be interested in starting their own police department. Generally, most are seeking local control and consistency with policing and policy making on how law enforcement happens in their community. Rarely is it of a negative consequence. It's just, hey, we're growing and we feel like we'd have more of our own control. Some more of the right reasons for starting a police department. And I think in Newberry, I don't hear anyone that's dissatisfied with the level of service that we're necessarily getting or the quality of service that we're getting. But there's some thought that we could get increased presence for law enforcement, more neighborhood policing, and potentially at a competitive cost or maybe potentially lower cost. So that's some of the reasons why. Oops, sorry about that. I'll move that guy. Some of the wrong reasons for starting a police department. Don't suggest. I don't think any of these check the boxes for Newberry, but I think our research showed that you want to make sure that you're not going down the path of starting a police department for any of the wrong reasons. And our resources also kind of outline these checklists or critical tasks for success. Everywhere we've read, starting a police department is one of the most challenging things that your city will ever take on. But the slides that we're going to present you will kind of get us started on what an outline for those critical tasks to achieve success are. So an initial staffing plan, and what we are showing is the initial staffing plan. It's pretty basic and rudimentary. Of course, you can add on to that. Staff strongly recommends that before we start trying to get running, that we take those first few steps and we get ourselves established. So when the City Commission, and it might be next year, maybe 10 years, decides to begin their own police department, it is, let's get it stood up, working right. Staff's recommendation is get it stood up, working right, and then if we want to start adding on level of services, then once we feel comfortable that we've got it right, then I recommend that we take on those steps.
So Mike, just for clarity's sake, the positions you're showing would be a baseline department if the commission chose to start a Newberry Police Department. This would be the FTEs that you would suggest beginning with.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I think that there are cities out there that possibly do it with less, but we run a professional 4-person per shift fire department. Our commission has never really shown an appetite for decreasing that level of service and having some sort of a volunteer fire department. They feel like if you're going to jump into a public safety arena, you need to do it well and right. All the discussions that we've had in public meetings have led us to the same conclusion, that we're going to start with the minimum staffing requirement and have a professional police department, and that's what we're presenting tonight.
Commissioner Farnsworth.
Mike, I was just curious as to the 3 school resource officers. How come they're not being taken care of by the school board?
Well, Mr. Mayor, they are. I guess we show it in our org chart, but the current model around the Alachua County, with the School Board of Alachua County and the other law enforcement organizations in the county, is that the school board has been paying towards SROs, but those SROs are employed by one of the law enforcement agencies, either the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, Gainesville PD, Alachua PD, or High Springs PD. Now, 2 years ago when we had this presentation, the school board was funding just south of $20,000 per year per officer, which was a portion of what it cost for that officer, that annual compensation. That funding level jumped up considerably last year, up into the 40s, and next year it's projected to be $60,000 per year per officer. That gets into the range of just about fully paying for them. So if we talk to, say, like in Alachua or High Springs, they feel like the $60,000 per officer is right in line with what it's costing to employ that officer, so they're kind of feeling net neutral. So staff is presenting that it's kind of a pass-through for these SROs, but the school board doesn't employ any SROs. So they need an agency. Whoever the agency, local agency, has been employing those, the school board has been paying $60,000 towards them. In our model, we project that would get us more than 90% of the way to funding that position.
Do you know if, as the years progress and the salaries increase and benefits increase, are the funds from the school board going to be covering them at that time?
Mr. Mayor, no guarantee what's going to happen with the future funding from the school board, but I would say that the funding from the school board, the increases in funding from the school board has been outpacing the increased cost to maintain an SRO. You know, I'd say we've tripled in a course of 3 to 4 years the benefit from the school board, and those salaries are increasing. The cost for SROs are increasing at, you know, at a price index of maybe 3% a year, 4% a year. So I don't think anyone's making guarantees as to what police officers will make in the future or what the funding from the school board will be. But I think at this stage of the game, the trends have been that the school board is getting closer to funding more per officer than less per officer.
Question. Is that funding from the state of Florida, or is it?
Mr. Mayor, it's our understanding that the majority of that funding is from the state of Florida, although in a conversation with Superintendent Karen Clark today, she indicated that they have been taking more out of their general fund, what they call their general fund, to support this program this year than they have in years past.
But the bulk of the commissioner's question in terms of who's funding the SROs at this point, it's coming from Tallahassee. So in the years past, the school board has passed on whatever Tallahassee gives to whatever agency they contract with. So it's really a question of, will Tallahassee keep up with the increases more than will the school board keep up with the increases? But in any org chart that staff presents tonight, whether it's High Springs, ASO, or NPD, you'll see the resource officers, because whichever entity, it'll go through that entity. Go ahead.
So speaking of org charts, in addition to a staffing plan, we took the liberty of scratching out a proposed org chart. And as I mentioned previously, well, you notice that our staffing projections that we're showing tonight are more than we've talked about in the past, and that has to do with that level of professionalism. Things have been changing. You remember a couple years ago, the fire department went to 2 in, 2 out, where you were required to have 4 firemen on scene for any event. There's similar things have happening in the police side. We all see what's happening in the news with the threats that are coming upon police officers, and so having 2 officers available on all shifts is now more, it's more of a safety requirement and is becoming common operating procedure in all entities. In the days of we'll run a police officer from 8 to 5 and then let the sheriff handle it afterwards, we don't see too many communities doing something like that any longer. So just to kind of give you an idea of what staffing might look like during the day and on nights and weekends. During the daytime, you would have a chief and a deputy chief. You would have patrol officers, which would be a sergeant and an officer, and school resource officers, as well as potentially reserve officers and detectives. The detective would work kind of a swing shift, so they work as needed. They put 40 to 60 hours a weekend, but it's more of an as needed. They may work night shifts for a while, depending on the case, so they may work weekends. But normally, during the daytime, you would see the staff positions that we've shown on the day, and in the evening, you'd be left with 2 patrol officers and potentially a deputy or reserve officer.
And Mike, is it staff's recommendation that a beginning Newberry Police Department would need a detective?
It's Mr. Mayor, there will be need for investigation. In discussing both with APD and High Springs PD, when you're as thin-staffed as what we're proposing, trying to get the patrol officers to do investigations really is it's kind of a big task for them. They don't really have time to quite do a proper investigation. So High Springs is actually working to develop a detective position themselves, and in our conversation we talked about splitting one where it would actually be employed by High Springs PD, but Newberry could share that resource either with a High Springs PD alternative, or if a Newberry PD alternative, we could potentially share that resource as well, with both communities splitting the cost for it. So I would say of the things that we talk about from a staffing perspective tonight, we'll be talking about, when we talk about the detective, we're talking about a half-time detective. And that's certainly an area for discussion. The commission say we don't have the appetite for that yet, or we can't afford that yet. Whether we have 2 officers working the midnight shift, staff's going to recommend that we just need that for safety reasons. They need backup in town. So in addition to staffing, we looked at our equipment needs for fleet. You could either purchase equipment or lease it. Now they have very good lease programs out there. I know High Springs is utilizing a lease program. They very much like it. I believe Alachua is as well. You're very familiar with our VERF program, which is essentially the same thing. We would utilize one of those 2 vehicles. I think it's a little premature to make that decision. The vehicles need to be equipped with PCs and radios. Law enforcement officers would need vests and firearms and tasers and uniforms. There's a lot of equipment to be purchased to start up a police department. In the past, we've had a lot of conversations about startup costs versus operating costs. When we present costs to you tonight about Newberry PD, they're going to be levelized. We're going to assume that we will VERF all of these costs, no matter how we take them down, that we'll spread them across a startup period of likely 5 years and annualize it so that we're not seeing a very high startup cost and then a reduction as we move on to year 2. Office needs. The initial office space we anticipate is going to need to be in the 3,000 to 3,500 square foot. Again, that's bigger than what we had initially anticipated. We had discussions of using the old utility building across the street. Things like you got to have a secure evidence room. You got to have office space for a chief and a deputy chief. Officers need to have a place to sit down and interview people that want to come in. And you realize that a professional police department takes just a little bit more room than you may have initially thought. Because we can't build a facility in the time frame we're talking about, we think that we would get out of the gate by acquiring a rental unit, either renting or purchasing kind of a modular office building, siting it somewhere and setting it up to be our initial office space. And we could do that with a couple of offerings that we'll be suggesting tonight, either Newberry PD or the High Springs PD satellite office. Other things like office equipment and furnishings, computers, police departments have a very secure computer network system. They have an independent firewall. They're not just necessarily hooked straight into the city's computer system. They tie into the national databases for law enforcement, and they have their own secure stuff, so we'd be getting new file servers for them. They also utilize specialized software. So planning for all of that. I have to move that. Police station sites. If you're going to land a 3,000 to 3,500 square foot building, we inventoried our current land offerings, and outside of the wastewater plant, we don't really have land available to site something like that, and really the wastewater plant is not necessarily an ideal site. So typically, we looked at it, we think that it would require at least 3/4 of an acre, somewhere between 3/4 of an acre and 1 acre. There are plenty of candidate sites in town, so we didn't try to negotiate a deal. We identified some vacant areas. One is immediately adjacent to Newberry Fire Department across the street, proximity. We were of the impression that having visibility on a major corridor, either 45 or 26, might be good for a police department. People like them in their neighborhoods, but we're kind of wide open on that. We think that land could be as little as $50,000 up to no more than, we could probably get our best deal at $100,000 or $125,000 for a site of this. It would also, you need your regular stormwater and parking. Also, police departments need a secure compound where they can park vehicles or impound vehicles, things of that nature. Makes them a little bit larger than any commercial enterprise that may move into town. And staff's going to recommend, related to this, that regardless of what the commission decides to do for year 2021, if the commission sees that it that a Newberry Police Department or a satellite office for any entity could happen, staff's going to recommend that it'd probably be a good idea to go ahead and select that site and acquire it as soon as possible. These sites, I said there's plenty of them around there. They're not going to be around forever. We're on the verge of a lot of economic activity, so a lot of the sites that currently might be well suited for a police department may not be available in 5 years. And if we know we're going to have a police department, our recommendation is go ahead and acquire the site and stick a sign up and say future home, and we'll build it when we need it. Other considerations that the city is going to undertake if it starts Newberry Police Department are things like, what are we going to do for dispatch? We have a couple alternatives. High Springs does their own dispatch. No, they do not. My mistake. Alachua does its own dispatch, and we could contract with them. The Sheriff's Office has the Combined Communications Center. High Springs contracts with them. We could do our own. We could contract with APD potentially, or most likely we'd initially start with the Sheriff's Office, kind of along the lines of don't try to take off too many things at one time. If we think we might want to have our own dispatch, maybe we say that's for year 5, after year 5 sometime, but let's get our police department stood up and then see what a communication center looks like. Mutual aid agreements with other law enforcement entities, impacts on liability insurance, development of policies and procedures. Lots to do in the first year, in the planning year for getting ready for a police department. Timeline-wise, though, most people say that you can do it in 12 months. You don't really want to try it in less than 12 months. 12 months is comfortable. And speaking of planning, typically the first thing you do is not hire a police chief for this, although police chief is one of the first things you do, but probably to get out the gate, you'd have a steering or startup committee of people that have expertise in the area. So these are some candidates. It's certainly not the list. We may have had conversations with some of these folks to ask if there's interest, and nobody's committed, but no one said no yet. So these are just some candidates that we've considered might be part of a steering committee to point us in the right direction until a chief gets on board and got his legs under him, and it's moving along pretty well.
Mike, again, just for clarity's sake, we're about 14 months out on our contract. Our goal is to have, if the commission goes with the Newberry PD or High Springs PD, to have a 12-month period of time to get those startups. So we need, for our timeline's sake, we've got about 2 months to finish finalizing these conversations, talking with residents, and we need to have signed contracts in place at that 12-month period in time, whether it's to continue with ASO or obviously we don't need a contract with ourselves, but for High Springs. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct,
Okay.
Mr. Mayor. You may have segued into the next slide. So, preliminary budgeting, you got it.
So, Mr. Mayor, City Commissioners, the manager went through all of what MPD would look like, and I get to explain how much that would cost. In preparing this budget, we went through the same process we used to prepare our budgets for all other departments. We heavily looked at our fire departments. It's the closest department we have. We looked at High Springs, APD, the other cities listed. We relied on their expertise, as well as the resources the manager mentioned before. So the total expense for the law enforcement department would be a little over $1.7 million. As the manager discussed earlier, we would expect $180,000 reimbursement from the School Board of Alachua County in the amount of $180,000 for the school resource officers, which would bring the net cost to the city at just shy of $1.6 million. As with any public safety entity, the largest portion of your cost is going to be in your salaries. Obviously, the police department is at minimum staffed with 2 people, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, including holidays and everything. All of the salaries and fringe together is just over $1.2 million. In preparing our salaries and fringe, again, we looked at our peer cities. We adopted pay grids that we feel would be competitive and would attract the best and the brightest to Newberry Police Department, but are not obviously overpaying anybody. We feel these salaries are competitive. This also includes the high-risk FRS, as well as health insurance, all the other insurances the city offers, and workers' compensation insurance.
Dallas, before you leave that slide, are there any other departments that we need to consider? If you bring a chief in at 111, is that comparable in terms of services to what we pay our fire chief? Or is that, I know that 111 is kind of in the middle of the pack. Are we in the middle of the pack on our fire chief? Or if we bring in a police chief at 111, do we have to consider that we're now out of whack between departments?
Mr. Mayor, that's a very good question. I would reiterate, the 111 is total cost, fully
Right.
loaded. But we did compare the police chief to make sure that he or she would be in the same pay grid as our fire chief, as well as the deputy chiefs, and as best we could, comparable positions. It's kind of hard to compare
Sure.
police employees to other employees, but they're all they fit within the pay grids we currently have. So
I
nobody's
just
out
want
of
the
whack.
commission to know ahead of time if adopting that range means that we're going to have another employee step forward and say, wait a minute, how did that happen, right?
Correct. We don't
We'd
want
be
to
in
create
a
a domino
range.
effect.
Right.
And the other side of this is typically police departments are union departments. So a lot of this would be negotiated in their collective bargaining agreement, just as our fire department's salaries are negotiated in their collective bargaining agreement. In your operating costs, again, we worked with several departments to get a handle on these. We think this is a pretty close, if not, very close depiction of what it would cost to run the operating department. However, just to be extra safe, we did add a $50,000 contingency into the operating cost. We know things are going to come up, especially once you hire a police chief or a deputy chief who will know a little bit more about what is needed to run the department. So we did include that $50,000 contingency in there. Obviously, your largest costs are going to be communications and dispatch. We anticipate that based on our current call volume, a contract with the Combined Communications Center would run about $120,000 a year for dispatch. The remainder of that portion is for the radios that are in the car. We have to pay GRU for that radio system. And then after that, amortized equipment, as the manager mentioned earlier. There's a lot of equipment and capital needs for a police department. We've split those costs out amongst the lifespan of those items and then applied an inflation factor. So we anticipate it'll be about $1.2 million in total capital cost to start the department. Amortized out over the lifespans is $161,000 a year. But that does include everything we think a police department would need, and then the commission has a full breakdown of those items in the packet, as well as a full breakdown of the staffing and budget. Page 3 of the packet is the actual amortized items.
Dallas, I don't want to get too into the weeds on this thing, but can you tell me what kind of weapon? We need 18 weapons for a total cost of $65,000. What kind of Glock costs?
It includes a handgun, a rifle, and a taser.
Oh, so the 18 is not 18 weapons. It's 18
It's
personnel
18
that need to be weaponized.
Correct.
Okay, that makes a whole lot more sense to me.
And
I
we
just-
only actually have 16 that would need to be weaponized, but as our understanding, you should keep spares.
Okay, let's pause right now at this time for public questions and comments. Anyone have it? Come up to the mic, Madam Commissioner.
Good evening, Alina Lawson, citizen. On the original org chart, you had one staff assistant there, but on your budget, you mentioned support staff 1.5, and at any law enforcement agency, you need records. So is the support staff the 1.5, and where is that on the org chart for the records division? Because people request records and.
Dallas.
Mr. Mayor, the 1.5 is a half-time staff assistant and a full-time evidence manager, records manager. It is our current recommendation that the evidence manager and the records manager would handle records with support from the staff assistant.
I don't know that that'll work. An evidence manager usually stays pretty busy. and a records technician stays extremely busy. So you may want to look at that being both full-time each.
So, Commissioner, you're recommending that that would need to be 2 FTEs, one
That's
per
what
each?
I would think.
Okay. Did you have another question?
Other question, on the vehicles, are these pool cars or take-home cars? Are they shared pool cars or take-home vehicles?
Mr. Mayor, they're take-home vehicles.
They are take-home vehicles?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other public questions or comments about where we are so far in the presentation?
One thing on your detective, $27,672. Is that a part-time detective?
I think that's half, right?
It is
That would be Newberry's half shared with High Springs.
Okay. And also,
So you answered the question, well, yes, he would be, or she would be part-time. in the city of
okay,
Newberry.
that's fine, because I wouldn't work for that. But anyway, the other thing about ag department, we are an ag, Mr. Norfleet knows that, we use ag out here. Are we just going to borrow Alachua counties for that, or are we going to, like, get our own four-wheeler in the back? Oh, Coleman's going to do that. We're going to get a four-wheeler in the back and get a pickup truck.
I'm not quite sure that we're far enough down in our conversations for that. I do know that, there is a level of service that we already get by being taxpaying members of Alachua County. Now, flushing out what services you get by just being a member of Alachua County, I think what we would do is look to our peers to see what the sheriff provides to our peers who are either in the MSTU, not in the MSTU, or have their own police departments, and we would ask for the same level of service that is provided to everyone else in the county.
Because we did have to use one a few weeks ago, and he was great, as usual. All right, we'll continue. I'll come up with some
You'll
other
come up with
questions.
another question
Oh.
as we get in further.
They're in there, but
All
it
right.
just...
Any other public question or comment at this point in the presentation? Okay, if not, continue, Dallas.
Looking forward for the next 3 years, starting with fiscal year 2020, which is next fiscal year in the budget we're currently working on, staff would propose, if the commission intended to start Newberry Police Department, that we budget $200,000 in next year's budget to fund startup costs such as hiring a police chief about 6 months out from the start, hiring a deputy chief, and then hiring the rest of the staff before the new budget starts, as well as procuring a facility and the equipment needed so that on October 1st, Newberry Police Department could take over patrol within the city. Fiscal year 2021 would be that 1.58 that we talked about earlier, and then ongoing after that would be normal inflationary increases and then service level increases that the commission would desire.
Dallas, is this budget summary only for the Newberry PD, or would you, it seems like if you go with High Springs, there would be budgetary implications in 2020, even though it's not the full-fledged. So is that 200,000 for 2020? Would staff recommend that for High Springs PD as well?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. What we're talking about now is just Newberry
It's
Police
just Newberry
Department,
PD.
but we would recommend that if the commission were to go with the High Springs Police Department, there would also be startup costs such as buying equipment and finding a place for them that we would request funding in fiscal year 2020 for as well,
Okay.
Transition.
for a transition period.
Still you?
No, still me. In the planning timeline, as the mayor and manager mentioned earlier, it'll take a full 12 months, if not longer, to start Newberry Police Department. So in October, we would start planning for office facilities, fleet, communications, mutual aid, getting those contracts ready. About 6 months to 5 months out, so March, April of next year, we would begin the process to hire a police chief. Once we hired a police chief, we'd then hire a deputy chief. As it got closer to September, we'd hire the officers, the sergeants, the school resource officers, the technicians, and the admin assistants. The chief and the deputy chief during that 6-month period would start all the policies and procedures you need, setting up the department, getting everything ready so when we hire the officers we can be ready to go. There would be an overlap period between our contract ending with the sheriff's office and when the police department would take over full patrol of the city. We'd expect that time to be about a month. where we would train with ASO, train with our own policies, and be ready to go on October 1st.
So just some concluding thoughts. These are quotes taken out of some of the resource books that we use by communities that did start their own police department. You know, the monumental task, but the satisfaction that comes along with getting it up and running. And then I believe our next slide is questions about Newberry Police Department.
Okay, so I think we're using the Newberry PD as a baseline. Does the commission have any questions of staff about the Newberry Police Department, what it looks like, what it would cost, the timeline that it would take to implement before we move into alternatives? Commissioner, good for now. Does the public have any other questions or comments about what a Newberry Police Department would look like? Come on up, sir. Introduce yourself to us.
Good evening. My name is Richard. Citizen of Newberry. Is it on? Yeah, that's
You have a
great.
green light. All right.
Good. All right. Thank you very much to the dais and the city staff and everybody else that was able to come out here. I appreciate your time, especially on the safety concern. Quick question for Mr. Mayor, for the budget. How is this related to the current tax rate we're in now? I mean, are we looking at an increase? Are we looking at how we had like a fire assessment? Maybe some citizens would be concerned in the sense of, will we need to, for the startup costs, would this go on as like another assessment on our tax books? Has that been considered?
I think that the plan right now is to gather information. And what I'm hearing from staff is in either Newberry PD or High Springs PD, if you choose to have that contract, that it will be budgetary implications for the upcoming budget year, somewhere in the range of $200,000 to plan for this upcoming year. Now, I haven't had a chance, because I think it'd be premature, to talk about how we would fund that. I'm sure some of that could come in the way of belt tightening and cuts. Some of it would most likely look like an increased millage rate. I haven't heard any conversation about having, and I think it's an MBTU for police. Is that right, Dallas?
Mr. Mayor, current Florida law does not allow the City Commission to adopt an assessment for police service.
So it would be millage.
So it would either need to come from millage or belt tightening, like you said, or some other variety. The commission obviously has other assessments it could adopt to fund other portions of your government, as well as other taxes that could be levied to fund the police department.
Correct. But I think might want to ask that question again at the end of the night. We might have more information to discuss.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions from the public? Okay. If not, did any commissioners come up with anything that they are thinking about? If not, Mr. Manager, take us into our first alternative.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We'll transition into alternatives, law enforcement alternatives. We're going to start with kind of going through what our current level of services, our current contract services are. We currently are utilizing Alachua County Sheriff's Office, and that is a listing of what we received for our payment. This year is $806,000. Next year, our planned payment is going to be $836,000 per contract. We essentially get a full-time deputy, 3 SROs, and 4 crossing guards, and then the rest of the things on that list. And the Sheriff's Department will also tell you they are a full-service law enforcement agency, and they are. So all the other resources they have at their disposal in terms of investigations, helicopter service, SWAT service, all those sorts of things are available.
Services.
Yeah, they're available to Newberry if the need presents itself. So here's the cost for our contract. Well, maybe. Cost for our contract over the 3-year term, it started out at $770,000, and as I mentioned previously, we'll move up to $836,000 in fiscal year 2020, which is the upcoming fiscal year. The current services, and just show you this map. I know you've all seen it before. In our contract, we have a full-time 24/7 deputy that's also the Foxtrot deputy. Per the contract, unless there's a need for him to be pulled out of Newberry city limits, the Foxtrot deputy resides within Newberry city limits. Differential of, I guess the city limits is about half the size of the Foxtrot zone. So we looked at, as I mentioned previously, we've talked about 3 different agencies. We're going to present 7 alternatives, just variations of one another with those 3 agencies, which are Alachua County Sheriff's Office, High Springs Police Department, and the City of Newberry. Alternative number 1 has been asked about a couple of times by our commission. It's a model that is being utilized by the City of Micanopy, the City of Waldo, and La Crosse. We're not doing any type of enhanced law enforcement. We're going to take the basic level of service that we make in our general fund tax dollars. So the scope of services that we would receive for that is 1 24/7 deputy within the Foxtrot zone. So it wouldn't be dedicated exclusively to Newberry city limits, which is about half the size of Foxtrot. It would just be in the Foxtrot zone. 3 school resource deputies, which is provided per state law that there has to be a deputy in those schools. The city wouldn't pay any additional for that. It would be just whatever our current tax rate is and millage rate is. The cost differential for the city would be a savings of $836,000, and that's based upon what our cost for fiscal year 2020 will be. Our contract rate for 2020 is $836,000, and if we elect to do nothing, not be in an MSTU, not contract with anybody else, not start our own police department, and go with basic level law enforcement services, our residents would save $836,000 annually.
Under the scope of service, I don't see crossing guards. Are crossing guards also, I mean, the fact that the school resource officers are now mandated by Tallahassee to be there sort of firmly puts it with the school board. What about crossing guards? Are those mandated that we have crossing guards, or is that a service that the city can opt for or not?
Mr. Mayor, it's not our understanding that that is mandated by state law. That becomes a municipal preference. If the city wanted to have school crossing guards, we could likely contract with any law enforcement agency or simply perform that function ourselves. So there are alternatives for us to do that.
Okay.
The term would be indefinite. Annual multiplier takes nothing to enact it. Some comments, just under comments. Likely there could be some negative impacts with some of the other organizations that we partner with from time to time, either the Board of County Commissioners who might interpret that as us not paying our fair share. The school board could have the same type of reaction. So just that's a potential negative impact. I haven't heard anybody suggest that it would be. Staff anticipating how that might look.
Hang on one second, Mike. Commissioner Herson.
Mike, could you clarify how the school board could interpret that as us not paying our fair share?
Well, I won't speak for the school board. I will just tell you that the model around the community is that the communities and the school board have talked about 50-50 funding for these officers. So the sheriff's office has been aspiring to get the school board to go to 50-50 funding. And in Gainesville, Alachua, and High Springs, the school board has an offering, but it is understood or implied that the community is picking up the balance. So if Newberry is the one community that has school that doesn't offer any funding assistance for SROs, it could be viewed that they're not carrying their fair weight when a High Springs, Gainesville, unincorporated Alachua County, and Alachua are participating at some level, which is, debatable at what level they're all participating. So that is how it could be interpreted. Again, I've not had that conversation with any member of the school board. I just know I have heard the Alachua County Board of County Commissioners suggests that they don't feel that Newberry pays their fair share, being in the contractual arrangement that we currently are in. So if we took a step back, I expect that their feelings towards that would be increased, and potentially the school board might feel the same way.
Commissioner Farnsworth.
Just another question about SROs. Now, the state did not mandate that the city have SROs. It's mandated that the school board pay for the SROs.
I think the state mandate is a split between, it's kind of like all things that come out of Tallahassee, it's a little vague. So and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the state statute reads that there's some mix between the county and the school board.
Okay, so it's not.
Without being very clear, is that?
That's clearly the understanding that we get. The school board indicates that they have alternatives available to them. They can contract with a law enforcement agency. They can privatize, or they could start their own law enforcement entity. I think they could even equip teachers to be armed. So the school board does have alternatives to them, and they have some funding available. But I think mostly around the state, it is seen as a joint venture between law enforcement and the school board in terms of cost splitting.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mike.
Any other questions about alternative ones? If not, we'll move on to our next alternative. The next alternative is...
You said Micanopy, La Crosse, and Waldo operate under that model.
They do, and it's an interesting point. None of those communities have public schools. The school board doesn't operate any schools in those communities, so we would be the first one to kind of find out what the school board's reaction is to having schools where a community isn't paying a fair share.
And you said Gainesville, Alachua, and High Springs all supplement the school board's costs for SROs?
To some extent.
To some extent.
Mr. Mayor,
Commissioner Farnsworth?
I thought
So all I can find is that.
It's like K through 8, it's a charter school.
So, Mr. Mayor, alternative number 2 is to join the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, MSTU. We were in that for several years up to 2016. From a scope of services, the level of service would remain as it is today. It's essentially the same services we get today. The cost is arrived at simply by multiplying the MSTU millage rate, which today is 3.7240, multiplied times your taxable property values. For Newberry residents, they would see their city taxes go down because right now law enforcement is paid out of city taxes. If we join the MSTU, then that's just a separate tax item on their property bill or on their tax bill. The cost differential in total for residents from fiscal year 20 would be $657,000 and some change. The term depends. We could be in the MSTU as long as we would like to be, or as long as the county commission says that there is going to be an MSTU. And the way that we sign up can change. I think historically Newberry re-upped every year. So every year we considered in January or February whether we wanted to be in it, and we adopted an ordinance, and it had to be done by March the 1st. Other communities got in the MSTU one time by ordinance and said they'd pass another ordinance, adopt another ordinance getting out if they ever want to get out. So you have options to do either. The annual multiplier really depends on your taxable property values and the MSTU rate, which is set by the Alachua County Board of County Commissioners. As I mentioned previously, how we enact, and we've covered the comments. We used to be in it, and it would be a reduction in Newberry's millage rate.
Hang on right there. Now, Commissioner Martin.
Mike, do you or does anybody else know, is the Alachua County Sheriff's Office funded completely through the MSTU? Or is there part?
Mr. Mayor, I do know the question to that. It is not fully funded through the MSTU. I think it has probably receives more funds through county property values millage rates, or standard general fund millage, and is supplemented by MSTU dollars.
and when you think about it, there's only 2 cities left in the county that are in the MSTU, and then the unincorporated parts of the county are obviously in the MSTU.
Correct.
So maybe Colonel Huckstep, you might know the answer to this question. The last time I talked about this in a public format with the VOCC, one of the sticking points for us with the MSTU is we had to adopt it before we knew what the millage rate was going to be. And they had talked about potentially adjusting their timelines so that when the sheriff went to the municipalities and said it's that time of year again, she'd also be able to say, this is what it would cost, this is the rate. I haven't not followed up with them to find out. Have you had any communication with them about adjusting that timeline?
No, we have not. I'm very familiar with what you're talking about. March 1st is your deadline. You
Right.
won't know what your bill is until October. And as far as I know, there's been no change.
Okay, thank you, sir.
So that's alternative number 2. If you have questions, we'd be happy. We can always come back as well. All right. So we'll move on to alternative number 3. I guess that is closest to what we have today. It's a contract rate with this level of service that we are currently getting today. Colonel Huckstep from the Sheriff's Office indicated that the cost for 2021, if we were to do some sort of a contract extension, would be just north of $1 million annually. That would be a cost increase of $170,000 for us. We did not firm up a term. I guess it was understood in the meeting that it would be somewhere in the 3 to 5 year range, with the annual multiplier being simply the employee benefits increase, the cost for employee benefits, that's retirement, insurance, and we're on slide number 38, and wage increases. So we'd set that base amount, go for a term with just those increases, and then reevaluate as we got to the end of the term. To enact that, we'd simply enter into another agreement as we currently are in, and as I indicated previously, that's our current arrangement.
Mike, I have 2 questions on this alternative. One, on the scope of services, it says support for special events. In our previous contract, this board used as an example to define the enhanced services. We talked about the homecoming parade, the watermelon parade, and West Fest. And only one of those events is actually a city-run event, but they all got lumped in. So if the commission directs staff to go back and work on this proposal more, I'd like to rectify that situation, because we do not have the ability to negotiate for the Watermelon Committee or the high school for those kinds of parades. I'd like, whatever the offering is, I'd like it to all just be lumped in. Whatever ASO does in terms of special events is just what happens, without trying to draw lines between different entities and what they get charged or.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, and we had actually, if you recall, last January, we had developed an amendment to the contract that clarified that. The parades that were identified in the contract extension that did not get executed was homecoming, Christmas parade, and not the watermelon parade, because that was clearly being established by a different entity. And so, but once we get to that, it's kind of an issue that isn't the primary issue of our agreement. We can hash out what we think is more appropriate.
That would be my feedback. If we push forward with this option, I'd like to see the school not be. I'd like to see that just be part of the enhanced services. The schools not be charged when ASO participates in their events, or the Watermelon Festival when they participate in those events. So I'd like that to be part of our conversation. And second, can you tell the commission how did ASO and staff get to the 1 million mark?
ASO proposed it to us. They went and they looked very hard at the services they were offering, and they felt like that this was a number that they could justify based on, I guess, an element of our community that just doesn't seem to draw law enforcement. And so they felt like that this number was justifiable. They were comfortable that they could provide the service for that.
And I guess my follow-up question, I mean, I think that's a very reasonable offering given where we are now. But certainly what Newberry contracts with ASO has been a source of contention with the county commission. So I'm not sure if Colonel Huckstep is prepared to speak to that point in particular. But I guess my question would be, if we proceed with alternative 3, would ASO and the city of Newberry sort of stand side by side and explain to the BOCC how we got here and why we think it's fair and why it should no longer be a source of contention between the city of Newberry and the BOCC?
Yes, Mayor. We've had some discussion with some commissioners. They feel very strongly that the current contract we have now is not a fair one in their favor. And so this number that we came up, there is a formula. We came up with a formula that we implemented, and we proposed it, thinking that it would satisfy. It would be fair for the city of Newberry, covering its appropriate costs. It would be fair to the county commission, and it's less of a hit to you than the direct MSTU. And it builds in the inflation builder, our costs increase with FRS and insurance and et cetera for the future years of that contract.
Okay.
So it would protect them, and the commissioners that we did have discussion with seemed okay with it.
Commissioners I had conversations with seemed okay with it as well.
Yes, sir.
So just to make sure we all have a full understanding of what we're embarking on, but I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Any additional questions about alternative number 3? If not, we'll move on to alternative number 4. I'd point out that alternatives 1 through 3 are either a decrease in level of service or maintaining the same level of service. I think the next few alternatives are all for increased level of service. Alachua County Sheriff's Office also offered a level of service that would put 2 24/7 patrol deputies in Newberry, in addition to all the other things they already provide. So wouldn't just be the Foxtrot deputy, it would be a second dedicated. We'd see an increased level of service. There'd be an extra patrol car in our city limits every hour of the day, every day of the year, I guess, unless they're transporting a prisoner or something along those lines. The cost for that service would be $1.8 million annually. Cost difference would be nearly $1 million from what we'll be paying next year. Same term, same annual multiplier, same executed contract as the vehicle to get there. And as I previously mentioned, this is an increase of level of service from our current level of service.
I just want to pause on this point as well, because while the residents in the city of Newberry have a very diverse perspective on the decision that's in front of you, they almost to a T agree that there should be 2 patrolling officers in the city of Newberry. And in fact, the last time we had this conversation, I would say the biggest source of confusion, even moments after the conversation was had, is that most residents in the city of Newberry believe that for our contract for extended services or enhanced services, we are paying for another deputy on top of the Foxtrot deputy. So, and that's simply not the case. The enhanced services that we get continue to only pay for the 1 deputy in Foxtrot. So I need to be very, very clear about that point, because for whatever reason, we could not get clarity on that point the last time we had this conversation. And most residents in the city of Newberry were under the belief that we had the 1 officer in Foxtrot and we were paying for enhanced services to add an additional officer to that, so that there would be 2, because sometimes that deputy has to take people to the jail. But right now, and to continue the level of service that we have right now, there would continue to just be 1 patrolling officer in the city of Newberry. So for many of the other options we're going to look at now, we will be talking about 2 patrolling officers, but I just need to try again to be real clear on this point, that if our current contract is 1 patrolling officer, it's that officer that's in Foxtrot. Go ahead, Mike. Are there any questions about that, Commissioner Farnsworth?
It just seems that $800,000 seems rather excessive for 1 extra deputy.
Mr. Mayor, I have seen the county's breakdown on how they arrive at these costs. One 24-hour deputy actually results in them hiring 5 officers to cover a 24-hour shift without failure. And the cost fully loaded for equipment, cars, uniforms, all the things that come with a deputy, training, for 5 of them is the additional $825,000 that you see. They have very detailed breakdown to support it.
All right,
And-
let's go through. Do we have any more alternatives with ACO?
No, this is our last alternative
Okay.
with ACO. We're kind of dead in the water until Dallas comes
Well, let's
back.
pause for a second and get community feedback on the alternatives that we have now. Come on, make your way.
Joy Glanzer. Mr. Mayor, so just a quick question. The last number 4 alternative was about 1.8 for the extra deputy,
Mhm.
but the annual cost to run the Newberry Police Department was about 1.2. So
1.5, almost
I thought
1.6.
that was just the first.
For it, 1.6 would cover the entire department, from chief down, operating costs,
deputies.
amortized, 2 deputies on patrol.
So we
and
still
those-
save money then, a couple $100,000.
Correct. One of the things that staff really needs feedback on from the commission and residents tonight is, do we believe that 1 officer is okay, or do we believe that we need 2 patrolling officers? Because it is a really important distinction in how we move forward.
Do we have 2 on the budget for the Newberry Police Department then?
We have 2 in the budget for Newberry PD.
But we only have 1 now.
And in fairness to ASO has, there's so many officers sort of moving around for ASO that they can have 1 patrolling officer in Newberry and feel confident that they can get another officer here. Newberry PD or High Springs PD would be more limited. They don't have as many officers. So both of those departments very strongly feel that if you're going to have a Newberry PD or High Springs, there has to be 2 officers on call all the time.
Okay.
But you would still, in either of those options, you still have the 1 officer in Foxtrot from ASO.
Okay. Oh, even when we have our Newberry.
You pay for that 1 officer in Foxtrot in your regular property taxes. So every zone in the county has 1 on patrol. That person will stay.
Okay. Thanks.
Naeem Richard, resident. Mr. Mayor, question on, I'm in agreement with having 2, whether it's ASO. I do believe we are a growing city. I agree that we should have a little bit more on hand. However, I trust city staff very well. I've seen their budgets, I've seen their breakdowns. I've seen them take every dime and nickel to make it count. I still can't understand how we went from $1 million for 1 24/7, 3 resource, 4 crossing guards with all that support. And I can understand having 5 FTEs for that extra 1 that we need. But even if you're paying $100,000 per FTE, that's $500,000. There's like a $300,000 variance. So I'm confident in our city staff, Mr. Mayor. But I wanted to know, I know they saw the breakdown from the county, but dollar for dollar, did they get that breakdown from the county and compare it to the breakdown that we currently pay for that 1 cop that we have? Like, did they see if that cop was $1.10? Was cop number 2 going to be $1.10, or were they jacking up the price to $1.50 for that second cop?
So the way I understand your question is, did our staff look at the additional 800,000, I'm not sure the exact number, 800,000 for the additional 5 FTEs and compare it to the first 5 FTEs? Is
Dollar
that
for
correct?
dollar for the first one, correct.
Mr. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, we did not. We didn't feel it was appropriate to take a proposal from the sheriff's office for enhanced services and we said, would you consider providing a second full-time deputy and giving us that price, and they did, and then trying to dissect it to see whether we think it's an appropriate cost or not. I've seen that documentation in the past. I've seen it before. I know that it is back there, and I know they feel very strongly that the costs are what the costs are. So we didn't try to play the role of auditor or Monday morning quarterback and say,
That's their
how
offer.
you could. That's their offer.
And I heard you use the 110, but the 110 is the salary, the benefits, the retirement. It's not the cost of the car, the bullets, the training, the vests, those kinds. So when you add all those up, I'm not sure what per officer it is, but it's more than just the 110 for the salary and the retirement and those kinds of things.
I just figured I mean, I understand not to audit, but when we're talking about dollars and cents here, we should do a line item comparison, the cop A to cop B, and why this huge increase for a second cop, with all due respect to the sheriff and to the diocesan city staff. And the last question, if you don't mind, is have we inquired on others' failures? I believe that we should look at others' mistakes and make our own growth.
Of other cities?
Correct, like other municipalities like Waldo, I have written down Hampton, Hawthorne, some other municipalities that might have fallen short. Have we looked at what their downfall was so we don't make the same mistakes?
I can tell you the answer is absolutely yes. I don't know that guarantees that we won't make the same mistakes or similar mistakes, but we've absolutely, I've had conversations with Hawthorne, with Waldo, about why they made the decisions that they made, what happened. Personally, I had a conversation with the mayor. I'm trying to remember the city, but they made very similar to Brooksville, where they had a police department and then dissolved it to contract back with the county. So, I think we have those kinds of conversations as part of your due diligence, and you hope that by doing that due diligence, you don't make some of the same mistakes. But I think there's an infinite number of mistakes that could potentially be made, which is why we want to hear from lots of folks so that we can eliminate as many of them as we can.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Mayor, to each of those last two questions, I guess a challenge when you evaluate the cost for Alachua Sheriff's Office patrol in Newberry, as you mentioned, that first SRO is paid for via the general fund millage rate that we all pay. I think that's partially true. Foxtrot Zone is twice as big as Newberry. The rest of the zone is unincorporated Alachua County, and residents in unincorporated Alachua County are paying into the MSTU. So I think the line is very blurred on how much of that first deputy is general fund tax dollars, how much of it is unincorporated MSTU, and how much of it is Newberry's contract. We've never, in the 4 years that we've been negotiating with Alachua County, we've never been able to really drill in on exactly where that is. We've been able to agree on cost. Same thing with the SROs. They're partially funded by the school board. Then there's the general fund tax dollars that go towards SROs. There's the unincorporated MSTU dollars that go to SROs, and then there's Newberry's contract dollars that go to those SROs. Very hard to nail those down. That second patrol officer that we're asking for is fully funded by the city of Newberry in the proposal. There is no MSTU support. There is no general fund support. So it wasn't easy for us to go to compare the cost of first officer to the cost of the second officer. To the second question about the failures of others, at your point, absolutely. But there's a big difference between Hawthorne, Waldo, and Hampton and Newberry in terms of population. I mean, the closest one of those is a quarter of our size. None of them are growing. So I think that Brooksville is a better example of a community to look at. They're a little bit larger than us, and they haven't been growing, but they're on the cusp of starting a high growth rate. They ran into, political will, and the police department, as I understand it, they were having some, a challenging police department where the board of elected officials and the police chief disagreed on level of service, and their solution to that was, let's just contract for sheriff's office law enforcement will save our residents some money. So, but to your point, we did look at that, and whenever this commission says we want to start our own police department, we'll spend a lot of time trying to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of others.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions from the public?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Rob Baker, I'm the resident. Good evening, Commission.
Good evening.
I have a couple of questions regarding any agreements that might be reached with the Board of County Commissions. Do they have a representative here tonight? And I don't know if that'd be better
Maybe
directed to them.
You can ask, and I'll tell you if we can answer it, if it would be better for them.
I know that at the joint meeting in May, when the subject of the MSTU came up, County Commissioner Ken Cornell expressed some reservations about the contract that had been reached between Newberry and the sheriff's office, and about whether or not they were going to, I don't know if the word allow is the right word, but whether or not that might be litigated in the future. Has there been any follow-up with the Board of County Commission to have them weigh in on whether or not, if the commission were to choose to pursue a contract, whether they're going to sue us in response to that?
For me, almost on a weekly basis, and I don't think the right answer. I don't think the right word is sue. I think the county commission's leverage over the sheriff is that if the sheriff takes less from a municipality, they'll say, okay, well, you took X amount less from the city of Newberry, so that means you can serve this other municipality for X percentage less. And so that, I think that's where this, and Colonel Huckstep can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my general gist of the sheriff's position. She's between a rock and a hard place. So if she takes any less than the MSTU rate, it's not that the county would sue her, it's that the county would cut the budget to a corresponding percentage. Did I say that about right?
The follow-up question that I had, there had also been some discussion as it related to the setting of the county MSTU rate for law enforcement, that some of the municipalities, as a result of the level at which the MSTU law enforcement was being set, they were capping out on the amount that they could charge between, I think it's law enforcement and some other things that they offered as municipal services, and that the county was actually having to dial the rate back as a result of that. Is there any insight from the county as to whether or not that's a possibility in the upcoming budget years?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. You know, the MSTU doesn't hit the 10 mil cap. It's a separate. It is added in. So then that would be, I think that's actually, now that you say, I think that's what happened to Waldo, that they were getting pushed past the 10 mil cap. And so they almost by default had to opt out. Is that correct? Is my memory right on that?
Mr. Mayor, there was a challenge, especially whenever Alachua County offered fire services through a similar MSTU. Now that their fire service is not offered through an MSTU, it relieved what was a cap problem for many communities. Instead of having two MSTUs that both had to fit beneath the 10 mil cap, now there's only one, and at least moving the fire department into a fire assessment style of charge like we have, they've pushed off for some period of time the problem with the 10 mil cap with any of the small communities that I'm aware of.
Does that answer?
It does. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Any other public comment questions?
Deborah Campbell. The only problem I have is the ASO in this town does not do their job. Driving from Canterbury up to the light is like being on NASCAR on Sunday, okay? I'm in the left-hand lane, going the speed limit, so is everybody else, or maybe we're going a little faster, 5 miles over the aisle. The right-hand lane, 60, 70, passing us this. ASO writes no tickets in this town. If we had our own police department, we could write tickets and we could get our own money, because I am tired. It's dangerous out there, okay? That's just one opinion. I don't know why they don't do it. We used to get tickets in this town forever, but Sadie, say 6 years ago, decided no more. We knew our police officers. They were great people. She took them all away from us. We don't know them. As a resident in this town and the other residents in this town who have a lot of trouble in Countryway with people riding up on their yards and doing all this crazy stuff, our crime rate's not that high. I'm sad to see the domestic abuse up there. But I think our little town, my nephew is, been a police officer in Green Acres. Y'all probably don't know where that is. It's in Palm Beach County. And they had their own police office there. He was a policeman, fireman, SWAT, guard the president. For 20-something years, they had their own police department. He was up last weekend, and I asked him about it. And you might want to talk to him, because he's very brilliant about this. President Trump won the election. Good for him. But anyway, Green Acres had to go away and go with the sheriff's department because they needed more officers to guard the president. Summertime, he doesn't work as hard. Wintertime, 80 hours a week. But, you know, that little town is in a big city, and they did real well. And I think we could follow in that suit. I'm actually all for Newberry being the nice little town we have and having the officers and the resources that we have here. And we can write tickets. We don't need to be like Wallow and Stark and all those places, but we just need these people to start abiding by the law here. And ASO, I'm sorry, is not doing their job. It's dangerous out there.
Thank you. And just in fairness sake, I'll tell you, I could probably line up a lot of people who feel like ASO gives out too many tickets. So, yeah. All right, other public comments. We still have two other alternatives to go through as well. So, three. I'm sorry, cut staff short. So.
Evening, Michael Grant, citizen. I just have one question. With between any of the alternatives and our own police department, let's say we have a huge, quick increase in our population. Is it easier with one option or the other to add officers or positions?
So, is your question that is any of the alternatives easier to hire more people on?
Yeah, like more quickly.
I mean, my understanding, and I'd let staff answer this too, but my understanding is that law enforcement across the country is struggling right now to attract people to the field. So I'm not sure. I think that whoever the entity is going to struggle. I know that the sheriff is running a signing bonus. Is that correct? Give her a little. It's $5,000 signing bonus. Is that right? To sign on. So I'm not sure that that's going to change. You know, until this country really starts to pay law enforcement a wage. Staff, do you have any further?
Well, I think that to his question, if we get into say mid-year or mid-contract and we realize that our residents are outpacing our police law enforcement staffing, is how I interpret the question, could we do something about it? I think easiest to fix that would be Newberry Police Department. We run a budget adjustment if we think we need to staff up mid-year. If we're in a contract, we can do a contract amendment mid-year, and if we're in the MSTU, then we'd have to have a conversation. Right now, the MSTU doesn't anticipate staffing up because it gives us the one officer, and that's just it. I would also say just an observation of working in municipal government is rarely during the course of a year's time. I mean, coming back every year to reevaluate our budget is pretty darn quick. It feels like we're always in budget, doesn't it? That I can't imagine. We had a 10% growth rate one year in Newberry. Went from 5,400 residents to 6,000. That's a big growth rate and would not have reflected in a need for law enforcement staffing on just that type of time schedule. So I think probably our biggest need for additional staffing is going to be special events. You know, Canterbury gets up and running and they start having some big events. We may have some special details come out to help with traffic patrol or just patrol at the event.
I'll amend my answer because I think I understand the question now to agree with staff. The most direct would be that these 5 people right here have complete control over it. Now, whether that means they can get people, but it's a one-stop shop to make the decision. Any other option, you have to negotiate with another entity to make it happen.
Okay, that makes sense.
I have a comment too.
Okay. Commissioner Martin.
I'd also mention, Mr. Grant, even though our population actually has been going up, the calls for service have been going down a little bit. Not statistically significant, but they are kind of going in inverse relationship, if that gives you any comfort.
Sure. Just a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
So if we did have our own police department, we would actually take on the risk of maybe not having, the full staff that was outlined in the org chart if we didn't, or were not able to attract, like you said, people to take those positions.
I think that is a risk.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any other public questions or comment? We made it through alternative 4. Okay, all right.
Slideshow guy back. Alternative number 5 is the first alternative that you've seen from High Springs PD. You remember 2 years ago when we were having a conversation about High Springs PD, they could only offer school resource officer services because of a state law that says if you're not, if your city boundaries don't touch one another, the ability to provide law and services goes way up. You have to have a referendum on both sides. Both cities have to adopt a referendum saying you can do that. It seemed like it was a bigger challenge than either city was willing to undertake. In the meantime, in the last 2 years, we've become contiguous with High Springs. Our city limits touches theirs, and now they're able to provide law enforcement services in Newberry with the execution of a contract. So when we spoke with them, they offered, and I guess I'm going to start with, everything that is being offered by High Springs is an increase in level of service over what we have today. And everything that's offered by High Springs would be on top of the Foxtrot deputy, who's not going anywhere other than if we are going with High Springs, the Foxtrot deputy isn't committed to be inside our city limits. He would be committed to being inside the Foxtrot zone. And we're not in charge of those zones, so the sheriff can amend those zones as she needs on a year-to-year basis. So High Springs feels that the minimum, staff tells us that they got direction from their commission that they could have these conversations with Newberry, but it had to be net budget neutral to High Springs citizens, as in that it couldn't detract from the level of service that they're provided. They feel like they run a lean police department now, and that if they were having to split time with Newberry to provide services, that would detract from the level of service they're providing in High Springs. It's similar to the things that you would tell us if we were contemplating contracting with another community for any service. So the first thing that they indicate is that if they're not comfortable putting one patrol officer 24/7 in Newberry, they feel like that the need for backup is too great, that liability to them is too great, that if you're an officer and you get a call at 2 in the morning about a domestic dispute, you want to know that there's someone there to back you up, and the only sure way to make sure there's backup is to have 2 officers 24/7. So they propose 2 24/7 officers for patrol. They propose 3 school resource officers, as we've indicated previously. That's mostly a pass-through. We discussed a detective, and then we kind of discussed, well, let's, for at least for this discussion, let's call it half a detective. They're seeking to enhance their department by adding a detective position. So we talked about splitting that detective. They've indicated the needs for the evidence technician would be so great that we would have to have our own, and they have a supervising lieutenant proposed for school crossing guards, and then the same additional. One of the differences about the High Springs offering is that it really would look like a satellite operation. The cars would be marked Newberry. The cars would be owned by the city of Newberry. The uniforms would be Newberry. They'd be owned by Newberry. The armory, the sidearms, and the rifles. Most all the equipment, the facilities would be owned by Newberry, staffed by High Springs, under the command of High Springs. And so it's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison with what we're getting with the Sheriff's Department in terms of what the look and feel of that police department would be inside of our city limits. The cost for the level of service that's being shown there is about a little over $1.5 million. And in fairness, we levelized that. They gave us a first-year startup cost that was a little over $1.6 million, and then ongoing after that about $1.4 million, and so we levelize that first-year cost. We levelize that first-year cost over a 5-year contract to come to the $1.52 million. The payment to High Springs would not be 1.5. The payment to High Springs would be about 1.1. The balance, the $400,000 balance, would be the cost that we're incurring for vehicles, equipment, facilities, all those other things that I mentioned previously.
Mike, can you explain where the SRO money comes in? Is the cost 1.5 minus the 180,000, or is the cost really 1.7?
Yes. The actual cost is 1.7. Then we net out the 180,000 for 3 SROs and arrive at a cost of 1.5.
Okay. Commissioner Farnsworth?
So the extra $400,000 or so, is that a one-time cost?
No, sir, that's annually. I mean,
Still
that's the
annual?
VERF payment we'd be making for fleet, for fuel, for dispatch to the Combined Communication Center. It's about $120,000 a year for dispatch services. The vehicles we would own, the fuel they'd be getting from our fuel yard, the facilities, the 3,000 square foot facilities we'd be providing, and it would be ongoing.
But it was something that we'd own ourselves, so it'd be.
Correct. Yeah, if we contract with High Springs for 5 years, and then in that relationship, we'd have fleet vehicles to decide what to do with. Now, if they release vehicles, we could return them, or we could, if we had purchased them outright and High Springs wanted to take them with them, if they were going to keep the officers. But these additional costs are things that we would be taking on.
Commissioner Martin was still formulating.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It seems to me I've heard somewhere along the line that there's a certain price for using the Combined Communication Center up to a certain number of calls. Once you're over that call, the price per call is multiplied. Is that considered in here?
10,000
10,000.
population, but that's 10,000 for High Springs, 10,000 for Newberry. It wouldn't be added together. I'm assuming that wouldn't be added together. Okay.
Okay. So, yes, we believe we're still a fair number of years away from that 10,000 population threshold that trips us into a different price bracket for Combined Communication Center.
One other question. To Commissioner Farnsworth's point, this is a $1.5 million cost to us. Not all of it goes to the High Springs, because some of the assets, so to speak, for lack of a better description, involved here are ones that we retain. So in the event 5 years from now we ended the contract with High Springs, we keep all that stuff if we want, or we can sell it, or we would have it in the bank for our own police department if we wanted to do that at that time, or any combination therein, right?
Correct.
Okay, just clarifying. Thank you.
And my last question on this, to Commissioner Lawson's question point. High Springs agrees that one evidence technician is enough?
With
Come on, without banging your knee. Come on down and, yeah, watch the TV there and get your head on the way back in.
Jennifer Stahl, Finance Director. The staffing pattern is just a little bit different, and I'm sorry I didn't catch this before. We actually have 5 sergeants that are in this for supervision. So basically, one's on all the time. So you have 2 officers and then 1 sergeant, and then the admin, another additional 0.5 for admin.
On top of the one
On top,
evidence technician?
yes.
Does the 1.5 million change? Or do you agree with the 1.5 million? So we get more people for the 1.5?
Correct.
Okay, all right. Then that's an okay thing to miss, as long as it doesn't change the price. Right. Okay. So she is adding 5 sergeants and 1 half-time assistant. I'm sure I'm getting that title incorrect.
Well, Mr. Mayor, we indicated at the beginning of the workshop that we would roll out of here with some things to follow up on, as I'm looking, well, maybe we prepared this worksheet, so maybe that's why I'm not getting it, but it's not what we have listed in this outline, but we'll get that cleared away. We'll email the commission and say, here's the clarity.
But the
We
price,
figured out.
Newberry and High Springs are in agreement for this. There may be some staffing changes, but whatever that is, the price of 1.5 stays the same.
Correct. Yes, sir, that is correct.
Are there any other questions, Commissioner Martin?
Although she's pointing to 5 sergeants, that's 5 FTEs to be able to staff 24/7.
Correct.
Okay. We'll go ahead and take a public question while our staff make your way.
And Mr. Mayor, I was going to point out one thing. Just in conversations with High Springs, I understand from High Springs that they have one person that serves in the position of evidence technician and records management, and that is a very, very busy person. They might desire to have 2 FTEs, but I don't think they're doing that currently. We might get some clarity from them later in the meeting. That's another thing we'll follow up on, whether we need, one of each.
Head nods back there.
Or we currently have one. So I think, those are things we'll follow up on.
Okay. Quick question.
Mr. Mayor, just for clarification for public, because it seems like the numbers are going back and forth. So for 1.5 roughly, give or take, we're looking at two officers that will have basically Newberry branded on them and the patrol cars, correct?
Correct.
So it won't just be HSPD, it'll say City of Newberry as well on their patrol cars, or is it independent? Like, will it just say City of Newberry?
I'm sure it will identify both agencies on it,
okay.
but High Springs has been very gracious about making sure that the Newberry officers and the Newberry vehicles, uniforms will have Newberry integrated into it, so people will know that this is a Newberry unit.
All right. And then the other question is if I just heard correctly, I mean, we have that one lieutenant up there, and as well as the detective. What's not included was the sergeant. Is that correct?
I think what the clarification was we'll need 5 sergeants in order to provide one 24/7. Correct.
Okay. So,
and the only thing I would correct, you have 2 patrolling officers, then you have 1 lieutenant who's also stationed either at the substation or maybe on patrol as well. So there would be 3. Now the lieutenant's not a 24/7, my understanding.
Correct.
The lieutenant's more of a weekday position.
Correct.
Right?
what about
But
the sergeant?
the sergeant is 24/7.
So we would have 3 in essence.
We would have 2 patrolling. You'd have 1 lieutenant from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. You'd have 1 ASO in Foxtrot.
Correct.
So
What I meant was the sergeant, Mr. Mayor.
the sergeant would be on patrol.
One of the 2
One of the 2 on
patrolling
patrol.
is a sergeant.
Is a sergeant.
There's
Okay.
not 3 patrolling staff, there's 2, one of which is a sergeant.
One, okay.
2 patrol.
So that would be 3 total.
All right.
So that's 3.
Well, let's finish this and then we'll get some clarification here because I think we may need it between the city of High Springs and the city of Newberry just to make sure we're presenting the right information.
I just didn't want to come out too early, but this kind of makes it feel like High Springs is giving us the road work to becoming our own PD versus they're kind of like giving us a rent to own option.
Right.
Versus where now we're just stuck with a rent.
I think everyone understands that at some point in time, the city of Newberry will need its own police department, and High Springs is certainly offering us an option to slowly segue us in that, as Commissioner Martin said, the equipment, the cars, the vehicles, all of that would belong to the city of Newberry.
So in essence, I'm sorry for taking up more time. This is an investment into the city of Newberry versus, like I was stating earlier.
Some of it is.
Some of it is, yeah.
Okay. Versus none of it being an investment.
I think I understand what you're saying, yes. All right.
Mr. Mayor?
Commissioner Martin?
Yeah, some of it is an investment, but, with the ASO option, since we're not making that investment, that's why the price is a third less
Right.
also. I mean, it goes down to $1 million.
I'm just trying to find the best bang for our buck, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Diane.
So maybe, Mr. Manager, you could continue while Dallas goes back and clarifies the sergeants for us. Or you think you've got it figured out?
Mr. Mayor, I think that the clarity on staffing is going to take beyond tonight's workshop.
Okay.
We're looking at
As
our
long as that
spreadsheets.
1.5 doesn't, that's what everybody's in agreement with.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't think we'll work it out tonight.
Yeah. We'll work out the title and rank of everybody as we go.
Yes, sir. Alternative, Mr. Mayor, alternative number 6 has to do with an enhanced offering by High Springs PD. It's the same thing as alternative 5, plus the addition of a captain, 3 K-9 units, and 2 traffic officers. So it's, as you would expect, it is a higher priced alternative. The cost to Newberry would be $1.8 million. The cost of that, we would pay High Springs, where's that number at, Dallas? $1.4 million. The rest would be costs that we bear for the same list that on the previous slides. The cost difference between if we move to this alternative in year 2021 would be $977,000. Same term, annual multiplier would be price index, same contract, and in terms of it would still include the basic patrol deputy in the Foxtrot zone. So it'd just be an enhancement. We'd have 2 full-time officers plus Foxtrot plus potentially a sergeant that we're still going to have to figure out, and then K-9 units, traffic officers, and a captain.
Okay. It seems appropriate to me to maybe ask Chief DeCourcy if he wouldn't mind coming up and just talking to us a little bit about the 2 different options here. I think that this commission truly wants to make sure that we are keeping everyone in the city of Newberry safe. And so if there's a strong pitch for the different options, I'd like to hear it. I'm not exactly sure that I know the difference between a patrolling officer and a traffic officer. I think I could make a guess. But if you could tell us a little bit about the differences there, and what could the residents in Newberry expect between alternative 6 and 5? Welcome, sir.
Primarily, bottom line is what type of police services that you want. And what we came up with these numbers because we want to make sure that the citizens are safe and the officers are safe. And therefore, what happened over in California, one of the events could easily happen here. So we don't want to make sure, we want to make sure everybody's safe.
Is the in-house on? Oh, sorry.
Can you turn the volume up a little bit on the podium, Mike?
Can you hear me now?
They'll get you from back there.
Okay, all
Just
right.
turn it up a little bit.
Well, we just want to make sure that everybody stays safe. And again, we're not in competition with anybody. We're just here to offer service, and the sheriff's office are good partners, and we just want to clarify that. We're not trying to compete with them and the services they provided. We were asked to do something, and we want to make sure that we give you the best options and alternatives so you could make an informed decision. So when you said an officer, a traffic officer primarily is just that. They concentrate on areas that possibly, for instance, in neighborhoods or your main thoroughfare, if there's a problem with traffic, they work whenever the problem is out there. And that's what we put them in that area to do. Patrol primarily is just that. They work the community and they be visible, but the traffic is unique to concentrating on traffic, public safety, not just necessarily writing tickets. They want to inform the public. They do events. They be out for at schools and any civic organization that requires information about traffic enforcement, the new laws, texting and driving. They'll be the ones to educate the public on that.
And let me start, I should have started with this, how much we appreciate your willingness to be here and provide these options to us and have this conversation with us. But you are very comfortable that the option that doesn't have the traffic officers still keeps the city of Newberry and the officers safe.
Absolutely.
Either of those is fine. These are things that the commission can consider having, which would be additions to the services, but don't have any effect on safety.
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Commissioner Farnsworth?
Now, are the traffic officers 24/7, or is that? how's
No,
that
sir,
work?
primarily, if there's a problem, for instance, if traffic in the mornings or evenings, when people are coming to and from work, are aggressive drivers, or we get complaints, primarily the citizens' responsibility to call in, or we have patrol units that see something that's possibly a concern, then we'll address that.
So they'll only be on as an as-needed basis? They'll come into the city on as needed, or will they be here?
No, so they'll be here on a specific shift. For instance, you have an evening problem, they'll work evenings. You have a day's problem, they'll work days.
Commissioner, have any other questions? Deputy Chief?
Yes,
Welcome.
Antoine Shepard, Deputy Chief of Police, High Springs. I know someone asked earlier about the staffing patterns. What we've offered in Plan 1 is similar to what High Springs offer their citizens. That's basically 2 patrol officers and a sergeant doing each shift. We do that because we believe very much into supervisory and the liability there. We also stack those numbers because currently we're about 4 positions down, and that's because a couple of FMLA leaves and new hires, because we don't count them. They have probably about 4 or 5 months of training, and so you want to keep that in consideration when you get in your police department or whatever alternative, because you're going to have to deal with those in staffing. So we kind of stack those numbers so that we can be able to take or inherit those vacancies and still be able to run a police department for our citizens.
One final thought, Mr. Mayor, just to make sure I reiterate the fact that we work in conjunction with the Sheriff's Office and all the law enforcement, so we're a community, and if somebody needs help, they're going to get it.
I love to hear that. Thank you so much. Okay, Mr. Manager, any other questions about alternative 6 from the dais? Okay, how many more alternatives?
One.
We have one more. Let's do that one, and then we'll open the floor back up.
Mr. Mayor, the last alternative is one that we kind of, I guess, briefed when we were discussing Newberry PD, but now we've just identified it with the rest of the alternatives. The Newberry offering from a staffing perspective is a replication of the High Springs offering. So once we get to the bottom of exactly what that is, we anticipate that it is at least 2 patrol officers 24/7. Supervising sergeant, we still have to figure out, and my apologies for not having clarity on that. Also, the resource officers, splitting a detective, evidence technician / records technician. For Newberry, instead of a lieutenant, it was a chief and a deputy chief, some crossing guards, and then the regular offering of support. The cost for that, our annualized cost for that is nearly $1.6 million, $1.582 million. It's a cost difference of $745,000 above what our cost will be next year. The term is indefinite. Annual multiplier is price indexing, or when the commission says we want an increased level of service, we want an ag unit. That's going to involve an officer or 2 and some 4-wheelers or some 4-wheel drives, and we understand that's going to come at a cost increase. And then in addition to Newberry PD, again, the ACSO, Alachua County Sheriff's Office, would still have a Foxtrot deputy in our zone, and we would have agreements with both High Springs, Sheriff's Office, mutual aid agreements, and most likely Alachua PD as well, to support one another. As Chief DeCourcy indicated, when there's a need, everybody responds, and you do that by having mutual aid agreements in place.
Okay, Commissioner Martin.
It occurs to me that we're comparing the cost of the Newberry PD in the 2021 number to the current cost of the ASO contract, but if we were to contract with ASO, we're actually looking at $1 million, which is only a difference of 5 and change, or 6-ish, versus the 7.
Correct. The baseline is the 2020 contract cost,
Okay.
not the offering that ASO has made for 2021.
Okay.
And I think our next slide, what a great segue. Next slide kind of summarizes all of the offerings, the 7 alternatives that we've identified, staff's interpretation of whether that would be a change in level of service, whether it's a decrease, increase, or the same. The additional 24/7 patrol officers, you can see an asterisk there. Because our basic law enforcement has a deputy in the Foxtrot zone, we consider baseline and 0. So if you look at ASO basic, you'll see that there are 0 additional above the Foxtrot deputy. MSTU, 0 additional above Foxtrot. The current level of offer, 0 additional above Foxtrot. And then when you look at their enhanced services, so that's what that asterisk stands for. You can see how we determine what an increased level of service is versus same or decrease. Number of school resource officers that are being provided by the alternative, the number of crossing guards, the annual cost, and the annual cost difference. And you can see for the basic service, that annual cost would be a savings of $836,000. And then as you go down through the alternatives, you can see what the cost increases are. To Commissioner Martin's point, alternative number 3 shows an increase of $170,000. That's because that's the difference between next year's cost and the $1,007,000 that was offered for 2021.
I want to just give people in the audience and the folks up here a chance to digest that graph, because there's there's a lot of information to kind of take in. Just make sure we all understand the differences are from the 2021. I'm sorry, for the 2020, that projected cost, and then what each option would be from that point on.
Mr. Mayor, and another way of looking at that last column, the annual cost difference, that from a budgeting perspective, that's the amount of revenues that we're going to need to find to afford those options.
Okay.
Whichever option. That's why we show that column.
Okay. So there's one officer in Foxtrot. So the first 3 are 0. We could contract with ASO to provide 1 more. Our High Springs, our MPD, would be 2 more plus the 1. So 3 officers in this area for the last 3. Is that correct?
Yes.
1 in Foxtrot, which is bigger than just Newberry, and 2 that are bound in Newberry's limits.
Correct.
Okay.
We do have one last slide. Couldn't fit it all on one. It's the same table. You'll see the last 2 columns are the additions. We show the annual cost difference, which you saw on the last slide, plus the millage rate impact. If we decided, or if you decided you wanted to fund the increases straight through millage rate, as Dallas previously indicated, there are other alternatives, not necessarily a law enforcement assessment or an MSBU, but we could fund law enforcement out of a millage rate, out of our general fund millage, and then choose an assessment for roads, or we could do the water utility tax that you've opted not to do, that most communities do, and that would help offset. As the mayor mentioned, there may be some belt tightening. There's some things, if you look at public safety, that you may say law enforcement is more important than something else, and we could do some belt tightening in those average. And the last column is the annual cost per residence to the actual tax-paying home. That's what their tax bill might see an increase of.
Now, Mike and Dallas may have this down. In my memory, roughly 1.5 of our current millage goes to pay law enforcement services. Is that approximating? Closer to 2. So does that account? I mean, if the option is anything other than continue with ASO, that 2 mills to ACSO wouldn't necessarily go away, but it would be diverted to something else.
Mr. Mayor, this is how much you would need to increase your millage above what you currently have, taking into consideration that $836,000 would immediately then go to whatever other alternative you took. So for example, if you look at ACSO MSTU, well, that's a bad example. Number 3, your current offering, we have $836,000 in the budget. In our current millage, we need to increase another $170,000 through revenue. to make up the difference, which is 0.385 mils, to generate that 170,000.
Okay, so in option
It's in
5,
addition to.
it's an additional 6, just under 7, and that takes 1.5,
Correct.
but we get the first 8 that we pay right now for closer to 2. Is that,
It's 1.89 for what we pay now. It's the millage rate impact for our current payment is
Yeah.
1.8917. If we wanted to add 683,000 on that for alternative 5, there'd be an additional 1.5451 mils.
okay, all right, does that make sense to everybody else? Now it just makes sense, it might have made sense to you guys right off the bat, so. Okay, question, is this the last slide?
That's the
from
last
staff?
slide before we move on to questions and things
Okay,
of that
let's
nature.
begin with the dais. Questions, comments, thoughts, staff, and certainly you can wait to give your feedback until after you hear from the public. But I think staff needs to know options that you're not interested in at all, service levels that you definitely want to pursue, so that staff can continue their conversations with both the sheriff and with High Springs on to a more fine-tuned point. And I guess I will, well, we're missing one commissioner, so let's just start with questions. Anybody have any? You want to hear from the public? All right, public questions or comments?
And Mr. Mayor, while she's coming up, or while they're coming up, just this table here is the last 2 slides put together.
So I have a bunch of questions because I was saving them up, Mr. Mayor.
All right.
Jessica Mrozinski Baker, citizen. The first question I have, the first question I have, and some of these may not have an answer, unfortunately. There was talk that for fiscal year 20, we would budget $200,000 in our budget. And after looking at the cost for both High Springs and Newberry, that seems kind of low given the timeline that was provided. Are we going to need more in fiscal year 2020 to enter into either of those options? Lumping High Springs all together.
I think the answer is most likely. Now that's the transition cost.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know exactly what those would be, but I think the idea is that as we work through the process, we would supplement whatever else we needed over that amount with some additional belt tightening. So I don't know that this board can budget precisely for what that expense would be, since we don't really know what that transition, what we need to pay for up front. We can make educated guesses, but we can't fine tune it down. Did you want to add anything to that, Mr. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, we feel comfortable enough with that number. I mean, it may not be spot on, but there shouldn't be any big surprises. We've anticipated how long people would be employed, so we've anticipated the staffing number, like we'll hire chief 6 months out, we'll hire, I guess that's for the Newberry option, we would hire chief 6 months out. For the High Springs option, we'd be acquiring some things 6 months out, but a lot of the things will float into the VERF, and will then we'll see payments in the following fiscal year, and then we have a contingency in our budget as well. So we've got $50,000 in contingency for unexpected expenses.
Okay. Next question.
Do the space estimates for the size we would need for a substation, our own police station, take into account room for things like impound and other services that go hand in hand with the police department?
Mr. Manager, you want to take that one?
Yes,
And there is a difference there between NPD and High Springs and ASO. If it's NPD, we have to be able to provide all of that. If it's High Springs, we would be able to utilize some of those resources in their city.
And do any of the High Springs or Newberry options take into account revenues we would collect from ticketing, and how would that be how would that be handled with High Springs separately?
I believe
and
that
those options.
that answer is pretty complicated, so I'm gonna let Dallas take it because I think the state comes in on that.
Mr. Mayor, we already get a portion of the tickets that are written within the city of Newberry. We get our portion based off of a very complicated formula. It's not a lot. I think we currently get about $7,000 a year in ticket revenue. I don't believe it's the city commission's intent to fund the police department with ticket revenue, and if it was, we'd have to write a lot of tickets.
Their police department, so.
And I think the state takes the bulk of the money that any agency writes for a tick. Yeah.
Okay. I probably have more, but.
You can always come back for round 2. Other resident questions or comments?
Good evening.
Good evening, ma'am. Welcome.
Gail K. Watson, citizen. I have a general question. And I want to know, does the city evaluate their contracts on an annual basis, and are there measurable outcomes? Like the sheriff department or the lawyer, attorney or whatever.
Well, our relationship with the sheriff's department has been in flux. We were in the MSTU for a long time, and I'm not sure there were necessarily measurables there. I think the sheriff still came out and gave us a yearly update in the MSTU. We began the contract with a 1-year contract, and we almost immediately began to evaluate what that was, the level of service, the cost, and then the contract that we're in now is for 3 years. The sheriff still comes out and gives us a yearly state of the city update about levels of service, calls, reportables, those kinds of things. So is that answering close to your question?
Well, I hear pros and I hear cons about, what's going on. So my question is, do you, as commissioners and mayor, do you really know what's going on, or you just take whatever is presented as, yeah?
Well, Ms. Manager, you want to take a dive at that?
Well, just with regards to the performance measures, the agreement we have with Alachua County Sheriff's Office is that they provide the same law enforcement in our city limits that they provide countywide. So we're not in a position to say we want police service offered differently. The Foxtrot deputy, he's got a zone that is partially Newberry and a zone that is partially unincorporated. From the sheriff's perspective, they want to say there's one set of rules of engagement. These are our performance standard, and she sets it. So we've agreed as a community that's contracting with the sheriff to live with the level of service that she provides countywide. If we were in a different type of arrangement, then we would probably have more say in the operations of how that goes, and certainly if Newberry's running its own police department, you absolutely would do those things. But I think I'd say 90% of it is industry standard, just like with our fire department, which we operate. The majority of how they operate that department is set by the industry and the expectations of our citizens for industry standards. The rest comes down to, do we want to be a basic level life support or an advanced life support? And this commission has said we want advanced life support. That's the call that we make when we operate our own police department or when we contract a satellite station that is still Newberry cars and Newberry uniforms, things of that nature.
Commissioner Farnsworth, did you want to try to answer the resident's question? Sure.
That's one of the contentions I have is one of her concern. How do we have a contract with Alachua County for enhanced services, yet how do we know we're receiving those services? Are we just taking their word that they have a deputy here 24/7, or are we just, is there any way to verify that, or any answer on that one?
Mr. Mayor, the Sheriff's Office has what they call a DIRT report. And the language in our contract says that there's a Foxtrot deputy, and to the extent call load permitting, that deputy will be in our city limits. The sheriff explained whenever we were negotiating that contract and whenever we were discussing it in front of the commission that the Foxtrot deputy gets called into unincorporated parts of Foxtrot zone to answer a call. They take that call. An arrest is made and the Foxtrot deputy needs to run over to the jail. They make that run. Typically, one of the zone deputies from either the north or the south, I can't remember the names of the zones, can try to swing in and provide overlap. They have a zone sergeant that sometimes will pitch in and move in, so they try to make to fill in on those gaps. A dirt report details where everybody is in the county at any one time, but takes a pretty high level of digging in to understand it all and interpret it all, and we haven't taken that on, quite frankly.
And I guess what I would say to your question is, I think there's pros and cons to everything, and there's probably no one perfect solution to any issue. I've never particularly questioned the level of service that we get from ASO. I think it's an excellent level of service. And I know that we have residents that are not pleased. I think we have a lot of other residents that are completely satisfied. I've never had call to question those reports that the sheriff gives. I think you could probably find times where a deputy is having to run somebody to the jail. I think you could probably also find times where there's maybe 2 or 3 officers from ASO that are in the city of Newberry. So in my mind, it just kind of levels out. So we know what we're told. We know the reports that we're given, and I think we all also clearly hear residents and residents' concerns about what they're seeing in the neighborhood and the communities as well. I'm not sure if that quite answered your question, but all right. Any other questions from the public? Comments from the public? Welcome down, sir. Come on down.
Michael Grant, still. So I just wanted to say that I like the idea of having the traffic officers. I see in Newberry, it's not so much. Oh, I just got shocked. There we go. Okay. I saw the charts on there saying, like, our crime rates aren't really that high in comparison to kind of the other problems that I see. And I like that idea. So I also don't mind incurring that cost, to help provide that service. And remind everybody else here that I'm speaking for myself, not you guys. So that I like the idea of it, and also I don't mind supporting it. So thank you.
Any other questions from the public? Comments from the public?
Rob Baker, Newberry resident. I just wanted to briefly address, now that we're done with all the options, some of my thoughts on what's before us. Looking at the sheriff's report on the number of calls for service and the amount of crime we have in Newberry, we are now contemplating increasing the law enforcement presence in our city 200 to 300% based on what I would describe as a stable or perhaps declining crime rate here in the city. And to me, that seems very counterintuitive that we would spend that kind of money to do that. All of the options that are presented to increase our law enforcement presence here in the city are all very costly compared to what we're currently paying for law enforcement. I certainly understand that we can have, I think, reasonable discussions about what we're getting from the sheriff's office versus what we're paying the sheriff's office under the contract, and whether or not we want to stay in the MSTU or contract with the sheriff's office. But these options that we're pursuing, both for either having our police department or for contracting with High Springs Police Department, are going to cost our residents a lot of money, a significant amount of money. All that being said, I understand that all of you are elected, and I understand that there has been some public pressure for whatever reason, in spite of those statistics, to sort of codify some sort of agency or to sort of solidify a law enforcement organization that is Newberry's to control. And if that is your will as a commission, and if you feel that that's the will of the people, I don't think it makes any sense when the Newberry and the High Springs options are so close in price. I don't think it makes any sense at all to contract with High Springs Police Department. The difference in basic service from High Springs Police Department and a Newberry Police Department per resident per year, according to the last slide that was provided by Manager New, is $13 per household annually. And I'm willing to pay $13 to have our own police department if we are insistent that we're going to have more law enforcement presence in our city. I'll write that check right now. I think that High Springs is well-intentioned. I think they're providing us a lot of valuable insight into running a small-town police department. Not that, Newberry's a small town. We're certainly smaller compared to some other towns. But I do think that down the road there will eventually be problems and things like oversight, and if we decide we think we need to have another deputy, then we have to go to the High Springs committee or commission meeting again and talk to them about whether or not we agree with whatever decision. And I think that it's worth spending that $13 to have control over all those decisions going forward. So in short, I guess what I'm really trying to say is that I would very carefully consider whether this is really, really what we want to do to increase the law enforcement presence in our city that much and at that great of an expense at this point, and not to get frustrated with the situation with the county and just decide that we are absolutely gung-ho for getting out of any relationship with the county and providing law enforcement and going forward with doing a municipal law enforcement, either partnering with High Springs or not.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you. Other public comment, questions?
All right, Naeem Merchant, sorry about that. It's more of comment and concern as a citizen. I understand what Mr. Baker is saying. I take his comments to heart as well. However, I'm looking at what are we getting for the money we're going to spend. We're going to spend this money anyways. Where are we getting the best bang for our buck? Where are we getting the numbers from? We heard from a citizen earlier about the traffic situation. High Springs is already on top of it, saying that they have a solution for our problem. Their solution for our problem costs as much as it would cost just to get an extra deputy from ASO. They're willing to give us 2 traffic cops, 2 patrol units, a lieutenant, the dogs. I mean, the full spectrum for what it would cost for 1 deputy. Not just to that fact is, I love our ASO in town. I respect all of them from Casey Hamilton all the way to Lieutenant Levy. They're awesome people. I'm not disputing that fact. What my concern is, what am I paying for when we call enhanced services? Is it really enhanced by 1? Or would I rather pay just a little bit more to get way more bang for my buck? On top of that, a segue into MPD. And I believe High Springs is offering the training wheels to get us there in 5 years or in 10 years. We're getting that rent-to-own option with High Springs. I don't feel that I'm getting that rent-to-own option with ASO. I feel like we're just going to get further in debt, and we're going to get into a bigger hole by continuing these contracts of back and forth for $1 million, $800,000 for another deputy. Well, here's our option to become MPD, and that's where I feel we're getting the best bang for our buck.
Thank you, sir. Other public comment, questions? Okay, Commissioner Norfleet.
I got 2 questions on that. On the, I guess the several options with ASO and High Springs. Those departments, on any of those options, how many deputies would they have to hire, or do they already have them on staff? And what's the turnover rate on those new hires that they hire?
Mr. Mayor, I would say that options 1, 2 and 3 would involve no new deputy hires. It's their current offering to Newberry. I think that, well, we'd lose 3 SROs, potentially with the number 1. In terms of, I guess, option number 4 would involve 5 new full-time deputies, and I think that I request that Colonel Huckstep maybe ring in on this. I don't have any idea what their turnover rate. I think it'd probably be best if he answered that and maybe confirm that I'm on track with my response so far.
Colonel.
It was just in the Gainesville Sun over the weekend, Gainesville Police.
Right now. So a lot of people don't want to do this job as they used to in the past. So right now we only have 2 vacancies, and he is correct. Option 4 would be 5 additional deputies to add 1 full-time 24/7, 365.
What about Hot Springs?
Mr. Mayor, the High Springs offering, it's in the breakdown. If you'll
And
pull
the
out.
deputy chief is making his way down.
Okay,
Ted.
if you pull out this sheet right here, and if you'll look under, while their deputy chief makes his way down, if you'll look under what they're proposing, on the left-hand column, you can see the list of personnel and the number. It starts with, 1 lieutenant, half a detective, 5 sergeants, and on down.
You have the list for the additional personnel, so that would be all new. We would not be providing officers from our agency. As the question in terms of personnel, we have no vacancies currently right now. Last year, we did get hit with 3 vacancies all at one time, which is unusual, but all of those applicants or former employees remained on the reserves and was placed into the private sector. So we rarely have vacancies with our agency.
And I guess a follow-up to that, Deputy Chief, would be there's been some concern expressed with either beginning a Newberry PD or having to hire so many with the shortage that's going on nationwide. Do you share that concern? Do you generally feel like you'd be able to hire that many new officers?
I believe we could, but make no bones about it, it's difficult hiring into law enforcement and finding quality candidates at this moment. So.
Commissioner Norfleet.
And the other question I got, with Newberry having several unincorporated areas within the kind of the, I guess, shotgun look of Newberry, how would that affect with MPD or with High Springs?
Typically, when those calls go to dispatch, the dispatch operator is going to know whether that's unincorporated or Newberry resident and then call the appropriate agency. I think that's probably something that the Alachua County's Combined Communication Center deals with on a daily basis. I think it differs a little bit from the fire department. In the fire department, we have first call zones. Doesn't matter whether it's unincorporated or incorporated. If you're in the zone, it's your first response territory. You hear Chief Butner talk about first response territory all the time. Police department doesn't work that way. If it's unincorporated, it'll go to the sheriff deputy. If it's in an incorporated area, it'll go to Newberry PD or High Springs PD, who's then serving as our law enforcement agency. And as I mentioned previously, we do have interlocals. So if something happens in an unincorporated area that's just adjacent to Newberry, I think it would be common to expect that Newberry would respond for backup and vice versa.
Okay. Further public questions, comments? I think we need to begin. Did you have Commissioner Martin? Yeah. Take it away.
To, I guess, get us to a conversation of providing staff some direction, when I look across this sheet, which is the combined last 2 slides, my appetite for 4 and 6 is pretty low. I crossed them out. Largely based on cost. largely based on that additional value and needed, and maybe a little bit of the sledgehammer approach to our quote-unquote crime problem. It leaves the other ones on the table, and I actually have crossed out the Newberry Police Department on my list. Strictly from a 100,000-foot view, first glance conversation tonight, I share some of the sentiments that have been brought up with regards to being able to staff our own department. I think our challenge may be magnified to hire those deputies or those police officers because we are new. I think they have their own challenges already and they're established. To think that we are new, I'd hate to think that we're maybe getting subpar or applicants rather. I don't know a whole lot about the law enforcement community, so that may be talking out of turn, but my appetite for Newberry Police Department at this point, just based on that, is pretty minor. That would turn me probably closer to maybe a 3 or actually a 5 option. Now those are significantly different in price, but we get a lot more bang for our buck, to Mr. Urchid's point, on a High Springs option number 5, as far as number of bodies on the streets, or on the street, so to speak. I would probably also cross off number 2 next, just because we kind of have the same levels of service. Why pay $1.5 million when we can pay $1 million? Just a little bit intuitive sense on that. I'm not sure about I think there are some arguments to be made about going with the basic, which would essentially get us back to rural option. Same thing that the unincorporated county gets, but it's a pretty low percentage option for me. I think I'd like to have something, particularly the crossing guards. Although it's 0 under the basic, we could hire in. We would have some costs in there, but we could almost equalize 1 and 3. So if I had to put a number on it and put an opinion out there, I would say right now I'm probably 60% in at number 5 option, and maybe about 40% or 30% at number 3, and maybe 10% at number 1. But it's kind of close between 3 and 5 for me. I kind of toggle back and forth.
I think that's a perfect level of feedback, actually, and I'd like to use that as a baseline to see if we can't trim off some of these 7. So is there any commissioner who really wants to put 2, 4, 6, and 7 back on the table? I've heard a couple of times that this board really believes eventually there'll be a Newberry Police Department, but that we would really like to utilize the services of someone that has the respect and gravitas like a Chief DeCourcy to help us in that transition period. So, Commissioner Farnsworth, I saw your hand. Is there an option you want back on?
Well, I'm kind of fond of number 6, actually, and I think with the increase, I mean, we have a lot of complaints regarding traffic, and I think the extra deputies to help control that would be a huge asset between the traffic at the schools, the traffic in the mornings going to work, and plus throughout the various subdivisions and all. Number 2 is totally out. Number 4 is totally out for me. And I did have one question. We got the call loads trends from the sheriff's department. I was wondering how that compares to High Springs with their extra deputies over there. Do they do 760 reports per year and 5,755 calls for service per year, or what that is?
Do we have that information now? I'm not sure if we had that ready tonight to have High Springs call load. And I'm not sure there is, Chief or Deputy Chief, can you give us a best guess, even if you can't give us a exact amount? Does this bar graph kind of reflect what goes on in the city of High Springs as well? We seem to be pretty close.
We're providing a monthly report for our commission. I can't tell you in terms of.
Can you get his mic on?
We perform a monthly report for our commission, but I can't tell you the specificity of the call load. But it is similar to the 6,000, 7,000 calls a year. But I can't tell you how many domestics and things of that nature.
And I'm assuming that if this board wanted to go with 5 or 6, we could begin with 5, and then if we wanted to, let's say we had a 5-year agreement, 1 year in, we decided that Commissioner Farnsworth is right, we'd be able to renegotiate that for the additional services? Okay.
There you go.
All right. So,
Mr. Mayor, just one other thing to Commissioner Farnsworth's point, that we've heard a lot more, we'd like another full-time patrol officer 24/7 than we've heard we'd like a part-time traffic unit. If the commission collectively says we'd like some part-time traffic unit cost consideration, we could have those conversations in the next few weeks before we come back for final decisions. Kind of let you know, I don't want to speak for any agency, but if it's, how about, a quarter of 2 patrol or traffic officers, and we'd expect reports to show they're spending a quarter of their time patrolling Newberry strictly for traffic. We didn't ask anybody to provide pricing like that. High Springs did offer it, but that's because they're in the business and they probably knew the things we want better than maybe we knew the things we want.
well, again, that's kind of the process of tonight, is
Correct.
Let's hear what services that people do want. Is there anybody interested in option 2? It seems to me there's only 2 cities left in the MSTU. That seems to be a process that's kind of going away. No one's interested in 2. Is anyone interested in 4? Okay. So I guess, and then let's talk a little bit about 1. Seems to me like 1 is a last ditch, So we can take 1 off. There's a 10% interest if there's no other option, right? So any other commissioner, we're down to really 3, 5. We do have some conversation about 6. Commissioner Coleman.
I know I voted for High Springs last time, but through this, I've seen what the county commission is actually doing to our underfunded sheriff's department. And some of my research, it's really underfunded. And my 2 options are going to be 3 and 5. And I'm opposite of what Tim is I honestly believe we're another 2 years out before we need to be. ASO has done a great job. They're everywhere. And I know it's Newberry, and because they want to go out there and eat at the wood yard all the time. But call times, actually getting to the calls and stuff, they've really been doing a good job. And and then looking at it as annual cost, they're throwing a pretty daggum good number at us right now. I hope that Sadie don't have to go back in front of the county commission and all of a sudden these numbers are going to be thrown out the window. That's when I'm going to say 5's 100% mine because of the way negotiations are. And I know it's got to be tough for her because it's tough for us to deal with that county commission. So, yeah, 3 and 5 are my two numbers.
Okay. It seems like we're gravitating towards 3 and 5. Is that, anybody want to make I mean, I take the residents' comments about a Newberry Police Department to heart. I also know that everyone is concerned about not necessarily the startup costs because I think they're about equal, but it's the, getting the right chief to lead that charge. It's the liability. It's those kinds of things. I think as a board and as a couple of other residents have said, it's kind of nice, I think the metaphor is training wheels, having somebody that's got the experience help us through that process. But is there anyone on the dais that wants to argue for 7, or are we collectively gravitating towards 3 and 5 as the two options? A head nod at this point I think would be fine. Commissioner Hersom, you still ponder down there? I don't want to rush you, but.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, just the difference in cost of $12, Mr. Baker's point is well taken. A $12 difference is not large, but that's a $12 difference on top of another $139 for our residents. So, I don't necessarily want to fall in love with the idea of a Newberry PD, but certainly High Springs is offering us a great value in option 5, and so I don't want to make a mistake just because we like the idea of jumping off into the deep end of our own police department yet.
Okay. Commissioner Martin?
Yeah, I would say the cost is almost a non-factor. I think my hesitation comes in the ability to execute it, and I don't want to just get out in front of our skis over it. It's not the biggest concern, I don't think, for residents to have our own police department. I appreciate the idea of having some of the control over it as well, but it's just not a leap that I'm willing to take, I don't think, at this point. And I agree. I think we're a few years out. Because think about a couple of these other departments that were brought up tonight that are relatively the same size. They've kind of been there, done that, got out of the business. And that may or may not be how we would perform, but that certainly is a heavy factor for me. But I agree the cost is negligible.
Commissioner Hersom?
From a staff standpoint, we've got a lot of things we want to be doing in town, and certainly law enforcement does fall into one of those. But I'm just thinking of the stepping up time in terms of trying to create our own police department compared to just trying to integrate or have High Springs come in and provide that service. What's the staff time difference look like between those two? And are we going to lose out on trying to do all the other things we're doing because we're trying to stand up a police department?
Mr. Mayor, it would be a sizable task for us to put energy into. That energy would happen in fiscal year 2020. We have some other initiatives that the commission has asked us to work on. Not to say that we wouldn't make this happen. We fit everything in that we need to, but to that point, it would require quite a considerable effort from the administrative team for 12 solid months, and it would have an impact on other initiatives the commission has asked us to move forward on.
To that point, upcoming years, AMI, still doing Canterbury, still working on ag tech, you know, and the daily operations. Commissioner Norfleet, you still waiting to chime in?
No, I'd probably lean towards option 3, as long as those numbers stay the same. And if the numbers kind of got a little skewed down the road, I'd probably be going towards number 5.
I think a couple of the things I'd like staff to get firmer answers on is, to me, I think stability in this question is really important. So the entities that are willing to enter into a 5-year contract would stand out to me. I think for High Springs, for Newberry particularly, the longer the contract is, that allows them to know that they, you know, they're taking on if you go with High Springs, they're going to hire all these people. You want to know that you've got an extended period of time. So I think everyone has agreed to 3 to 5 years. I would like the 5-year period of time. That way we know exactly what to budget for, what to plan for over the 5 years. I think we need to have more conversation on the detective, whether that's something that there may be a little bit of movement there. I'm not sure if High Springs is 100% committed to the half detective in High Springs. I had one other thing that it'll come to me in a minute, but those would be the things I would think about. Commissioner Coleman, you're going to help me out by reminding me. No, you're not. Crossing guards, but I think those are recognized in High Springs and ASO and in NPD. So those would be that would be my marching orders. You know, I would for option 3. My conversations with the BOCC have been that they would, so far, and those have all been tentative. I can't hold anybody's feet to the fire, but they would, all of the tension between the city of Newberry and the BOCC would go away. I haven't made it through that whole board yet, so there's still certainly a possibility, and it's, you know, I don't know, it's in my top 5 goals here, but certainly it is a goal in this process to eradicate that tension so that we can work on other things and not have to always continually come back to this question about whether or not Newberry is subsidizing the county or the county is subsidizing Newberry when it comes to law enforcement. So I think that part of the decision needs to be fleshed out just a little bit more. Again, it's not in my top 5 priorities, but it is a consideration about if we sign a 5-year contract for option 3. Does that mean we're signing on for 5 more years of back and forth when we're trying to do some other partnership with the county? So I'd ask, and maybe that's on us and me to have those conversations with the county to take some of the heat off of the sheriff and say, you know, are we all just going to be able to agree that this is what the sheriff says is fair and it's her department and we can accept that number or not? And so I'll try to have that fleshed out a little bit better for you, but I'm really interested in the years of the contract, and I also agree with staff that no matter what the decision is, that we should direct them to start looking for that dirt for some potential future site in Newberry. I'm not sure that that's something we have to pull the trigger on immediately, but in our long-term plans, no matter what way we go, I think we all agree that eventually we'll be at an NPD. Other considerations that you want staff, we're looking at 3 and 5 hard, and those would be what I'd ask you to go back and flesh out. Commissioner Farnsworth?
Yeah, the only thing I want to say about 5 is that we get 2+ extra officers that are 24/7 in the city of Newberry, not going to other areas. Plus, we start owning our cars, our equipment, and that can be laying the foundation. In 3 to 5 years, we will have should have the ability to have our own police department, and so that's one of the main reasons I'd go with High Springs.
and the lieutenant. So there'd be, which I'm still not sure about the day-to-day operations, but the lieutenant, Monday through Friday, I'm visioning kind of a 9 to 5 person who would ostensibly answer a call if something really bad happened and you needed, so there'd be 2 patrolling 24/7, a lieutenant during the week, the 1 ASO officer in Foxtrot. So it is a bigger price tag, but it is an awful lot more boots on the ground. So I want to hear, does staff feel like you have, we're looking at 3, we're looking at 5. Sounds like 3 is more on the elected official end to kind of flesh that out, except for the year of the contract. Can we get, is 3 or can we get a 5-year contract? And then I'll continue having those conversations, make sure that we can all live peacefully together if we go with option 3. Anything else that you want staff to really focus on for option 5? Anything staff feels like you need to hear from the commission for direction on for option 3 or for 5?
No, Mr. Mayor, I think that we understand. We're going to have discussions with both entities. I think, that it's kind of pointed out that that 3 and 5 are not necessarily an apples and apples comparison, so it won't be a who's cheaper. It's going to be whether we prefer this offering for this price or this offering for this price. We'll try to firm both up, make sure that we clearly understand all that we're getting in option 5. We kind of had a bit of misunderstanding about the sergeant. We'll get that clarified. We'll firm up prices, and we'll be ready to go in late August with additional information and a request for the commission to say we're going to do this. If we go with alternative 5, it's going to have a funding impact on fiscal year 2020. So we'll ask the commission to consider how they're going to fund that $200,000 in startup costs that we would need in 2020 as well. And we hope to be ready to go with contracts for execution by October the 1st.
Okay. Any final thoughts from the dais? Okay, let's have one last round of public comment based on the conversation you've heard up here. Anyone from the public have any final thoughts, comments, questions? Okay. Colonel?
Okay, one thing I heard here a lot tonight was about the traffic issue. The lady, Ms. Campbell, I believe, was in here earlier and mentioned that and said 6 years ago, well, she hit the nail right on the head. 6 years ago was when we implemented, because of the shooting that's going across the country in our schools, the elementary schools, is when we disbanded our traffic unit, disbanded our proactive team. It took 12 deputies to finish out putting deputies into our schools. That was before. Now it's law. We were ahead of our times, recognizing the danger that was out there in our community, and so we put priority number 1 is taking care of the kids in our schools. We have been fighting the commission to the point we even took it to the governor's office, reached a compromise rather than the governor making a decision, and we only got 5 of those deputies back. Ever since we've been trying to get our traffic unit back, we have never gotten our traffic unit back. So again, in our budget that we're currently before the county commission is for a traffic unit of 5 deputies and 1 supervisor. And the county manager is supporting that. We actually had 2 traffic units recommended. As you may have seen in the news recently, the fatalities just continue to increase on I-75. We have some of the dangerous sections in between Alachua County and I-75. That drains our resources when those kind of wrecks occur on the interstate. It takes everything we can. FHP is responsible for the paperwork and the investigation. We're responsible for everything else. It's not unusual to have 11 to 15 deputies responding to 1 crash on the interstate. And so we have not had an increase in staffing. So what we proposed was a traffic unit for an I-75 zone only. We would carve out I-75, make it a zone only, and we would have a traffic unit on I-75. We also are back asking for a regular countywide traffic unit for all enforcement across the county to get the original deputies that we lost to the school resource deputy program. The county's has not funded that. We are up, given for consideration again. The county manager is recommending the one for the countywide traffic unit. So if you have any influence with the county commissioners, that would help us in our budget, and that would help you and your community to getting, because the only traffic enforcement you get across the county right now is with the zone deputy in between calls. And if you know anything about what our call load is, they go call to call to call, and if they're not going to their call, they're answering another deputy's call as a backup, because that's all they've got for backup. So a traffic unit, again, what we used to have would be a dedicated traffic unit. It works the whole county. So when you have issues here, that traffic unit would come over here. So it would enhance your needs in regards to traffic enforcement. However, I remind you, those that we write tickets to are your citizens in your community, and they won't be too crazy about it, because I've been doing this a long time, and I'll get the complaints about, I'll just give you an example. Mile Run subdivision in the city of Gainesville, I watched commander for JPD years ago, and the president of the homeowner association says we're demanding to have more law enforcement presence there, so we did. We sent our traffic unit over there, and by the end of the day, they were pleading for us to go away, knock it off. We got the point. The citizens know who's speeding in their neighborhood. It's the people who live in the neighborhood. So recognize that you get what you ask for, that you're probably going to want it to not be a regular event on a daily basis. You might remind them what the speed limit is and move on to the next community. But we could use your assistance on a traffic unit to get the county commission to know that it's really important in your community, and it would help you if we had our traffic unit back.
I will definitely advocate for that, and I always remind citizens that it is a double-edged sword asking for enforcement. So, you know, I always appreciate law enforcement's discretionary ability to know the right thing to do in the moment. I think you guys do a wonderful job of that, and I do not envy you the position you're constantly in. Other public comment or questions? City Manager, did you have a final comment or question, thought?
Mr.
Mayor,
Mayor,
a question.
I just wanted to say, as we potentially put Newberry Police Department to bed for a period of time, that since the commission asked us to develop the information for this workshop, I heard many, many times, even if we're not ready to go, we're just going to put it up on a shelf. And I would say between the report that we handed out, which is way back here in the end, and the slide deck, Dallas was the primary author of this, and him and Chief Buckner did a tremendous amount of research. I ask you to familiarize yourself with it, and let's do exactly what the commission said they were going to do. Let's not waste this work. You know, there will be a time for Newberry PD. It may be 10 years, it may be 20 years. This is very useful information. It's a very well done report, thanks mostly to staff's engagement. I just ask the commission to recognize that and make sure we get good mileage out of it.
Absolutely, and I would just say that it's as far as many residents that we have that advocate for the creation of a Newberry Police Department, and it's not to take away from anybody else, but it's probably due to the great respect that everyone in this area has for Chief DeCourcy, that we just feel better about beginning this process with somebody who can help us, who has the experience exactly that we're looking for of how to bring this into creation, if that's the direction that we want to go. I want to thank ASO for everything that you guys have done to get to this point. I have no idea what decision the commission will make, but I know that you guys have put an awful lot of work into tonight. And no matter what decision, we have always enjoyed the relationship that we've had with ASO, and we look forward to continuing that. I want to thank the City of High Springs for being here and staying all night long. We really like to draw these conversations out over here and make sure that we do our due diligence, so we appreciate all of you being here tonight. Commissioner Nancy, thank you for being here. Hope you can take this conversation back. And thank staff for doing all of this work. It's a big decision that's in front of you guys about the future of law enforcement here in our city. But that's why you get paid the big bucks, is to make those hard decisions like that. And if there are no more final questions or comments tonight, we are adjourned.